You were standing at the edge of a field in the Loire Valley, in the early part of the year 1586. The morning light has only just begun to spread across the low hills to the east, and the sky directly above you holds a shade of pale blue that is so thin it seems almost white at the horizon. It is the kind of sky that comes after a winter that was not particularly harsh, but also not particularly wet, a winter that left the ground with just enough moisture to promise a beginning, but not enough to guarantee an end. The air against your face is cool, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from the chimney of a farmhouse that sits half a mile away, hidden behind a line of bare poplar trees whose branches look like fine charcoal lines drawn against the dawn. You can hear a rooster crowing from somewhere behind you, a single long note that stretches out and then fades into the general quiet of the countryside, a quiet that is made of small sounds, the rustle of a single dry leaf still clinging to a vine, the distant bark of a dog that is answered by nothing but more silence. Your boots are on the dirt path that runs between two large plots of land, and the dirt beneath your feet is not the heavy dark mud of early spring, but something looser and lighter, a soil that crumbles into powder when you press the toe of your boot into it. You kneel down, not because you need to, but because there is no hurry in this hour, and you pick up a handful of the earth. It sifts through your fingers with a soft hissing sound, leaving behind only a fine coating of dust on your palm, a dust that is a pale brownish grey, the colour of an old wool blanket that has been left in the sun too long. Further down the gentle slope of the field, a plough stands at rest where it was left the evening before. The iron share is dulled with a thin layer of rust that will rub off with the first few passes through the soil, and the long wooden beam points toward the far end of the plot where a single large oak tree marks the boundary. You walk toward the plough, and your footsteps make a soft crunching noise on the dry clods that were turned up last week, clods that have not been softened by any rain and that break apart under your weight with a dry snap. The plough handles are smooth from years of use, worn down to a polish by the grip of hands that have held them season after season. You place your own hands on the wood, feeling the coolness of it, even though the air is beginning to warm slightly with the rising sun. The grain of the wood is visible in long, straight lines, and there is a small knot near the top of the left handle, a dark eye in the pale timber. You do not start working immediately. You stand there with your hands on the plough, looking out across the length of the field that stretches for about 200 paces before it meets the narrow cart track that leads to the village. The soil in front of you has already been turned in neat furrows, row after row of dark earth that looks like a long brown wave frozen in place. But if you look closely, you can see that the crest of each furrow is already beginning to lighten, the top layer drying out and turning the same dusty shade as the path. This is the part of the morning when the world holds its breath, waiting for the sun to climb high enough to chase away the last of the coolness, and in this waiting there is a quiet observation that settles in your mind. An observation without alarm or worry, simply a noting of the way things are. The dew is thin this year. When you walked through the grass at the edge of the field, your boots did not come away wet, and the spider webs that are usually strung like tiny hammocks between the stalks of last year's weeds are empty of droplets, hanging limp and dry. You turn and look back toward the east, where the sun is now a bright sliver of gold just above the tree line. The light washes over the field, and it shows you the true color of the land. It is not a green landscape. Not yet. The winter wheat that was planted in the adjacent field is short, its leaves a muted bluish green that hugs the ground instead of reaching upward. You can see the rows clearly from where you stand, thin lines of color against the bare earth between them, and the overall impression is one of a tapestry that has faded over time, the threads worn and the pattern indistinct. A light breeze begins to move across the open space, and it comes from the north, a direction that usually brings a sharp chill at this time of year, but today brings only a mild coolness that stirs the fine hairs on your forearms. The breeze does not carry the smell of rain or the damp richness of a healthy spring. It carries only the dry scent of last autumn's fallen leaves that still lie in the ditch by the road, brittle and curled and smelling faintly of the dust that coats everything. The sound of the plough when it finally begins to move is a low, continuous grinding, a sound that is made by the iron shear cutting through the soil and the soil in turn sliding off the curved wooden moldboard. You are not the one pulling the plough, but you are watching the farmer who is, a man of middle years, whose face is as lined and weathered as the plough handles themselves. He wears a loose tunic of undyed linen and heavy woolen breeches, and his hands grip the wooden handles with an easy, practiced hold. The animal pulling the plough is a large ox of a dun colour, its hide marked with darker patches around the eyes and on the shoulders. The ox moves at a pace that is almost too slow to measure, one heavy hoof placed in front of the other, the muscles in its haunches shifting under the skin with each step. The chain that connects the yoke to the plough jingles softly, a sound that repeats at the same interval as the ox's footsteps, a slow rhythm that becomes part of the background of the morning, a metronome for the work. The ploughshare cuts into the earth, and the soil curls over, falling to the right side in a continuous ribbon. The farmer does not look up at the sky or round at the fields. His attention is fixed on the point where the iron meets the ground, on the depth and the straightness of the line. You can see his lips moving occasionally, not in speech but in a silent counting of the rows, or perhaps a prayer that is so old and so worn it requires no words, only the shape of them on the breath. You walk a little way behind the plough, stepping on the newly turned earth. It feels different underfoot, softer and more giving than the hard packed soil of the path. But as you look down, you notice that the underside of the clods is already dry. There is a faint dampness only if you dig your heel in deep, a coolness that lives about 6 inches below the surface. Above that, the soil is merely cool, not wet, and it breaks apart into small crumbs that scatter in the light wind. The farmer reaches the end of the row and, with a quiet word to the ox that sounds more like a low hum than a command, guides the animal in a wide, slow turn. The plough lifts slightly, the share scraping over the grass at the headland, and then it is lowered again, biting into the earth to begin the return journey. This is the rhythm of the day, a back and forth that we continue until the sun stands directly overhead and the heat forces a pause. For now, the air is still pleasant, with that thin coolness that belongs to March mornings, a coolness that will be remembered fondly in the months to come. You move away from the ploughing and walk toward the edge of the field, where a line of old grapevines grows along a low stone wall. The vines are still bare, their twisted, woody stems looking like the gnarled fingers of an old hand reaching out of the ground. The buds are just beginning to show, tiny points of green fuzz that are almost invisible unless you lean in close. You do lean in close, and you see that the buds are tight and hard, not yet swollen with the sap that will push out the first leaves. A single brown leaf from last year still clings to a tendril, and it rattles softly in the breeze, a sound like paper being folded. The stone wall itself is warm where the sun has been touching it for the past hour, and you place your palm flat against one of the larger stones. It is a piece of local limestone, pitted and rough, with small flecks of mica that catch the light and glitter faintly. The warmth is a comfort, a promise that the sun is doing its work even if the clouds are not. You look up at the sky again, and it is still that pale, washed-out blue, with only a few high wisps of cloud far to the west. Clouds so thin they look like the strokes of a dry brush on a canvas. In the distance, the church spire of the village is visible above the treetops. It is a simple stone structure, square and solid, with a cross at the top that catches the morning light and turns it into a small point of brilliance. The bells have not rung yet. They will ring at midday and again in the evening, marking the hours for those who work in the fields. The sound of the bells carries easily across the flat valley, a deep, resonant tone that seems to roll along the ground. You imagine that sound, how it will arrive later, and you compare it to the quiet of now, a quiet so complete that you can hear the blood moving in your own ears, a faint rushing that is the body's own reminder of its workings. A flock of small birds, sparrows perhaps, or finches, rises from a thicket of brambles near the ditch, their wings making a soft whirring sound as they lift into the air, circle once, and then settle back down into the same thicket, finding nothing to alarm them and no reason to leave. The farmer has completed another 2 passes with the plough, and the dark stripe of turned earth is now wider, a broad ribbon that cuts across the pale field. The ox stops at the end of the row without being told, its large head lowering to sniff at the grass, its breath steaming slightly in the cool air. The farmer leans on the plough handles, resting for a moment, his eyes scanning the work he has done. You see him bend down and pick up a handful of the soil, much as you did earlier. He squeezes it in his fist, then opens his hand and watches it fall. It does not hold its shape. It crumbles immediately, a dry cascade of grains and small pebbles. He wipes his hand on his tunic and says nothing. His face is calm, the face of a man who has seen many springs, some wet and some dry, and who understands that the weather is not something to be commanded or even complained about, only something to be observed and accepted. He clicks his tongue softly, and the ox begins to move again, the chain tightening, the plowshare finding its bite. The light is changing now, growing stronger and more yellow. The shadows that were long and blue when you first arrived have shortened and darkened, taking on a more definite shape. The shadow of the ox is a solid block of darkness that moves alongside it on the ground, and the shadow of the plough is a spindly, angular thing with the curved shape of the handles and the straight line of the beam. Your own shadow stretches out behind you, a tall, thin figure that mimics your every move. You begin to walk back toward the farmhouse, leaving the ploughman to his long, slow work. The path takes you past a small pond that sits in a hollow, fed by a spring that usually keeps it full even in the driest parts of summer. Today, the water level is visibly lower than it should be in March. A ring of bare mud, cracked into a pattern like the blaze on an old pot, surrounds the pond, and the reeds that grow at the edge are standing in only a few inches of water. The surface of the pond is still, reflecting the sky and the branches of a willow tree that leans over it, and the reflection is so perfect that it is difficult to tell where the real tree ends and the reflected one begins. A single leaf floats on the water, brown and curled, moving almost imperceptibly in a slow circle. You stop and watch it for a long time, the way it drifts without purpose, pushed by currents that are too small to see. The farmhouse is a low building of stone and timber, with a roof of curved clay tiles that have weathered to a soft orange-brown. Smoke rises from the chimney in a thin, steady column, and the smell of it is stronger here, mixed with the scent of baking bread that drifts from the open doorway. A woman sits on a low stool just outside the door, her hands busy with a task that involves a large wooden bowl and a handful of dried beans. She is sorting them, picking out the small stones and the shriveled ones, dropping the good beans into a clay pot beside her with a soft plinking sound. She looks up as you approach, and her gaze is mild and unsurprised. She returns to her sorting, her fingers moving with the same kind of practiced rhythm as the farmer's hands on the plough. The sound of the beans falling into the pot is a small, precise note, repeated over and over, a sound that is almost musical in its monotony. You sit down on the warm stones of the doorstep, your back against the door frame, and you feel the sun on your face. It is warmer now, and you close your eyes for a moment, letting the red darkness behind your eyelids replace the pale blue of the sky. The sounds of the farm settle around you, the distant grind of the plough, the soft plink of the beans, the crackle of the fire inside the house, and somewhere a rooster crowing again, as if it has forgotten that it already greeted the dawn. The air smells of dust and wood smoke and bread, and under it all, the faint, dry scent of a spring that is holding its breath, waiting for a rain that has not yet come. You have left the farmhouse and the sound of the plough behind, walking along the narrow cart track that leads toward the center of the hamlet. The sun is higher now, and the coolness of the early morning has been replaced by a gentle warmth that sits on your shoulders and the top of your head. A warmth that is not yet uncomfortable, but that carries within it a hint of the hotter hours to come. The track is lined on both sides with low stone walls, the same kind of limestone you touched earlier, and between the stones grow tufts of dry grass and the occasional thistle, its purple flower not yet in bloom, just a tight, spiny bud. Your footsteps make a soft crunching sound on the small pebbles and the packed earth, and every few steps you pass a spot where the track is worn down to the underlying rock, a smooth, pale grey surface that has been polished by the passage of carts and feet and hooves over many decades. The hamlet is not large, just a cluster of perhaps a dozen stone houses with their red-tiled roofs, arranged around a central open space where the earth is beaten hard and flat by the daily traffic of people and animals. In the middle of this open space stands the well. The well is old. You can see that immediately from the color and texture of the stones that form its circular wall. They are large, rough-hewn blocks of granite, a stone that is not found in this immediate area but was brought here long ago, perhaps when the village was first settled. The granite is a grey that leans toward blue in the shadows and toward warm silver in the sunlight, and it's speckled with tiny flecks of black mica and pale feldspar that catch the light in a subtle, shimmering way. The stones are fitted together without mortar in some places, with thin lines of lime mortar in others where repairs have been made over the years. The newer mortar a slightly different shade of off-white, like a scar that has healed but left a mark. The wall rises to about the height of your chest, forming a protective ring around the dark opening of the well shaft. On top of this wall sits a wooden frame, a sturdy construction of thick oak beams that have weathered to a deep, silvery brown. The beams are joined with wooden pegs and iron straps that are rusted to a dark orange, and from the center of this frame hangs a pulley, a wheel of dark wood with a groove worn deep into its circumference by the passage of countless ropes. The rope itself is coiled on a wooden windlass that is mounted on the side of the frame. A thick, hairy rope made of hemp, its fibers frayed in places and smooth in others. The color of it, a warm, golden tan, where it is new, and a darker, greasy brown, where hands have gripped it most often. You step closer to the well, and your hand comes to rest on the stone wall. The surface is cool and slightly rough under your palm, and you can feel the individual grains of the granite, the hard, crystalline texture of it. Leaning forward, you look down into the shaft, and the first thing you notice is the change in the air that rises from the depths. It is cooler than the air around you, and it carries a smell that is clean and mineral, like wet stone and deep earth, with just a trace of something metallic, the iron of the deep groundwater. The shaft is lined with the same granite blocks, and as your eyes adjust to the dimness, you can see the greenish-black patches of moss that grow on the stones below the level where the sun can reach. The moss looks soft and damp, a thick, velvety carpet that clings to the vertical surfaces, and here and there a tiny fern, a single frond of the most delicate green, unfurls from a crack in the mortar. The shaft goes down a long way, much further than you might expect, and the light from above only penetrates for the first 10 or 12 feet before it fades into a deep, cool shadow. At the very bottom, you can just make out a faint glimmer, a circle of darkness that is not quite black, but a very deep grey, reflecting the small amount of sky that reaches it. That circle is the surface of the water, and it is lower than it should be. You take hold of the rope where it hangs from the pulley, and the fibers are stiff and slightly prickly against your fingers. There is an iron hook at the end, and you lift the empty wooden bucket from where it rests on the stone coping. The bucket is made of oak staves held together by 2 iron hoops, one near the top and one near the bottom, and the wood is dark with age and water staining, though it is dry now, and the staves are slightly shrunken, leaving tiny gaps where you can see a sliver of light. The bucket is not heavy, just the pleasant weight of well-made wood and iron. You attach the iron hook to the bucket's handle, a thick loop of twisted iron that has been worn smooth by the friction of the hook, and you give the rope a gentle tug to make sure the connection is secure. Then you begin to turn the handle of the windlass. The windlass moves with a low creaking sound, a sound that is made by the wooden axle turning inside the wooden bearing, a sound that is as familiar to this village as the crowing of the rooster or the ring of the church bell. The handle is a smooth, rounded piece of wood, worn to a polish in the center where the palm of the hand presses, and as you turn it, the rope begins to unwind from the drum, passing over the pulley with a soft, continuous whirring sound. The bucket descends into the darkness, and you watch it go, the pale wood of it growing smaller and dimmer, until it is just a faint shape, and then only a deeper shadow within the shadow. The rope pays out steadily, and you count the turns of the windlass without really meaning to, a slow, silent count that marks the distance to the water. 1 turn, 2 turns, 3, each one releasing about 2 feet of rope, and you can feel the slight vibration of the rope running over the pulley transmitted through the wooden frame. The sound changes as the bucket goes deeper, the echo of the rope's creak and the pulley's whir becoming softer and more hollow, as if the well is swallowing the noise. Then, after a long, quiet moment, you hear it, a distant, hollow splash, a sound that is both sharp and muffled, like a stone dropped into a deep cavern. The sound travels up the stone shaft, and it reaches your ears as a soft plunk, followed by a series of faint, ringing echoes that bounce off the wet walls. The bucket has reached the water. You wait a moment, letting the bucket fill. You can imagine it down there, the wooden vessel slowly tipping and sinking as the water flows in through the gaps between the staves, the cold, dark water of the deep aquifer filling the space that was once filled with the warm, dry air of the surface. The rope goes slightly slack, and you know that the bucket is now full. You place your hands on the windlass handle again, and this time, when you begin to turn, the effort is different. The weight is there. A solid pulling resistance that travels up the rope, through the pulley, and into the windlass. It is not a great weight, not something that requires strain or struggle, but it is a definite presence, the weight of about 2 gallons of cold water plus the weight of the bucket itself. The creaking of the windlass is deeper now, a more substantial sound, and the rope, as it winds back onto the drum, is dark and wet, dripping small droplets that fall back into the shaft with soft pattering sounds. You turn the handle steadily, finding a rhythm, and the bucket rises slowly, inch by inch. Through the stone wall, you can feel the faint vibration of the rope moving, and you can hear the water sloshing gently inside the bucket, a soft, liquid sound that echoes up the shaft. The light from above grows stronger on the rope and the bucket as it nears the top, and you can see the wet gleam of the wood, the way the water has darkened the oak to a rich, almost black brown. The iron hoops are slick and shining, and the water drips from them in a steady, rhythmic pattern. When the bucket finally clears the stone coping, you stop turning the windlass and reach out to steady it, pulling the handle of the bucket toward you so that it rests on the edge of the well. The water inside is clear and still, and it reflects the blue of the sky and the shape of your own head and shoulders leaning over it. A few tiny bubbles cling to the inside of the bucket, and as you watch, they slowly detach and rise to the surface, popping with a sound so small it is barely audible. You unhook the bucket and lift it by its iron handle, feeling the full weight of it now in your hand and arm. The water is cold, so cold that you can feel the chill of it through the wood and the iron, a deep, penetrating cold that comes from the heart of the earth where the sun never reaches. You carry the bucket carefully across the open space toward a long stone trough that sits against the wall of one of the houses. The trough is carved from a single block of limestone, and its interior is stained a pale green by years of water and algae. A clay jug sits on the ground beside it, a tall, elegant vessel with a narrow neck and 2 small loop handles, its surface a warm, reddish-orange with a subtle glaze. You set the bucket down on the edge of the trough and pick up the clay jug, holding it steady with one hand while you lift the bucket with the other. Pouring the water is a slow and careful act. The stream that comes from the bucket is thick and clear, and it makes a hollow gurgling sound as it enters the narrow neck of the jug. You tip the bucket slowly, controlling the flow so that not a single drop is spilled. The water fills the jug, and the sound changes, becoming higher in pitch as the air inside is displaced, until finally the water reaches the brim, and a small silvery dome of surface tension rises just above the lip. You set the bucket down, still half full, and place the clay jug on the ground, where it sits cool and heavy and full. The water that remains in the bucket is for the animals, and you pour it into the stone trough. It splashes against the limestone with a sound that is both hard and soft, the sound of water meeting stone, and it quickly settles into a clear pool. The trough is long and shallow, and the water spreads out, reflecting the sky in a long, narrow strip of blue. Almost immediately, a small brown bird flits down from the thatched eaves of a nearby house, landing on the edge of the trough with a quick, precise movement. It dips its beak into the water, tilting its head back to swallow, and then it does it again, a series of quick, jerky motions that are both delicate and efficient. You watch the bird for a long moment, the way its tiny throat moves as it swallows, the way its eyes, like small black beads, dart from side to side, watching for any sign of danger. Then it flies away, as suddenly as it came, leaving only a few concentric ripples on the surface of the water. You return to the well, and stand there with your hands resting on the cool stone coping. The sun is warm on your back now, and you can feel the heat of it soaking through the fabric of your tunic. The village is quiet, with only the distant sound of a hammer on metal coming from the blacksmith's shop, a rhythmic clanging that is spaced far apart, each strike followed by a long pause as the smith examines his work. The smell of the well water lingers on your hands, a clean, mineral smell, and you notice the way the stone lip of the well is worn into a smooth, deep groove where the rope has rubbed against it over the years. The groove is polished to a silky smoothness, and it is a slightly different color than the rest of the stone, a darker gray with a faint sheen. You run your thumb along it, feeling the smooth, cool depression, and you think about all the buckets that have been drawn from this well, all the hands that have turned this windlass, all the water that has been carried to kitchens and gardens and troughs. The groove is a record of that work, a visible history written in stone by the friction of hemp rope. A woman comes out of one of the houses carrying an empty clay pot similar to the jug you just filled. She nods to you without speaking, a small, quiet acknowledgement, and she moves to the well. You step aside, and you watch her go through the same motions you just completed. The lifting of the bucket, the attachment to the hook, the turning of the windlass. Her movements are even smoother than yours, more practiced, the movements of someone who has done this thousands of times. The creak of the windlass starts again, the whir of the pulley, and then, after a long pause, the distant hollow splash. You listen to the sound of it, the way it echoes up from the depths. A sound that is both familiar and slightly different each time, depending on the level of the water and the stillness of the air. Today, the splash sounds deeper than you remember it sounding last summer, a longer fall before the water is reached. The woman feels it too. You can see it in the slight extra pause she takes before she begins to wind the bucket back up, a pause that acknowledges the extra distance, the extra weight of the rope, the lower water. The windlass creaks again, and the wet rope appears, dripping and dark. She lifts the full bucket with the same careful strength, and she carries it to her doorway, where she will use the water for the evening meal, for washing, for the small, essential tasks of living. You remain by the well for a while longer, letting the sun warm you, listening to the quiet sounds of the village. The blacksmith's hammer has stopped, and now there is only the soft cooing of pigeons from the dovecot, a low, murmuring sound that is like the well's echo made of feathers and air. The shadow of the well's wooden frame has shifted, grown shorter and darker, and the heat of the day is beginning to settle in earnest. You look once more into the dark shaft of the well, and you see the faint glimmer of the water far below, a circle of reflected light that seems impossibly distant. The air that rises from it is still cool, still carrying that clean, stony smell, and you breathe it in, letting it fill your lungs, before you turn away and begin to walk slowly back toward the cart track, the sound of the well's silence following you like a held breath. You have left the village and the well behind, walking now along a narrow footpath that cuts across the open ground between two large fields. The time is late May, and the sun has climbed high enough that the morning coolness is only a memory, replaced by a steady, enveloping warmth that seems to rise from the earth itself as much as it falls from the sky. The path is barely visible, just a faint depression in the grass where feet have passed often enough to keep the growth low, and as you walk, the dry blades brush against your ankles with a sound like a soft sigh. To your left and to your right, the fields stretch away in long, gentle slopes, and they are covered with wheat. But it is wheat of a particular kind, wheat that is not growing as it should. You stop walking and stand at the edge of one of these fields, looking out across the expanse of it, and the first thing that comes to your attention is the sound, or rather the absence of a particular sound. In a normal year by this time in the season, the wheat would be tall and green and full of movement, and the wind passing through it would create a rustling, a whispering, a sound like 1,000 small voices, all speaking at once in a language made of friction and air. That sound is not here. The wind is here, moving across the field in slow, warm gusts that you can feel against your face and your arms, but when it reaches the wheat, it produces only a faint, dry scratch, a sound like a broom being drawn lightly over a wooden floor. The wheat is short, you can see that clearly now as you look more closely. The stalks, which should be reaching toward your waist or even higher by this point in the spring, stand only about halfway up your shins. They are a color that is difficult to name, a green that has been mixed with gray and a little bit of yellow, the color of an old olive or the underside of a sage leaf. It is a muted, dusty green, and it gives the whole field a tired, faded appearance, as if the landscape has been left out in the sun too long and has lost its vibrancy. The rows are still visible, thin, straight lines of this pale green that run parallel to each other across the contour of the land, and between the rows, the bare earth is clearly visible. A strip of pale brown dust that is almost the same width as the strip of growing wheat. In a healthy field, the wheat plants would have grown together, their leaves touching and overlapping, forming a continuous dense canopy that hides the soil from view. Here, the soil is on full display, and it is dry and cracked, with small fissures that form a network of tiny, irregular lines like the glaze on a very old ceramic pot. You take a few steps into the field, moving carefully so as not to trample the struggling plants. The earth under your boots is hard and unyielding, and it makes a solid, thumping sound rather than the soft, giving crunch of moist soil. You kneel down, feeling the warmth of the ground through the fabric of your breeches, and you bring your face close to a single stalk of wheat. The plant is a small, self-contained world. The stem rises from the soil in a smooth, pale green tube that is marked at intervals by darker rings, the nodes where the leaves attach. The stem is stiff and somewhat brittle to the touch, not flexible and sappy as it would be in a wetter year. You take it gently between your thumb and forefinger, feeling the slight ridges along its length, the cool, dry texture of the outer skin. The leaves emerge from the nodes at a sharp angle, long and narrow and tapering to a fine point, and they are folded slightly inward along the central vein, a sign that the plant is trying to conserve the moisture that it does have. The edges of the leaves are not smooth but bear tiny, almost invisible serrations that you can just feel if you run your finger carefully along them from tip to base. The color of the leaves is that same dusty, muted green, and if you look very closely, you can see a fine, pale fuzz covering the surface, a microscopic layer of hairs that catch the light and give the leaf a slightly silvery sheen. The head of the wheat is still hidden inside the sheath of the uppermost leaf, a tight, swollen bundle that has not yet pushed its way out into the open air. You can feel it through the leaf, a small, firm nodule that promises the eventual emergence of the grain-bearing spike, but it is small, much smaller than it should be at this stage of the season, and the sheath that encloses it is tight and dry rather than plump and moist. You release the stalk and let it spring back into its upright position, where it stands stiffly among its neighbors, all of them equally short, equally pale, equally still. A gust of wind comes across the field, a warm, dry wind that seems to come from the south, and it stirs the wheat in a way that is strange and unfamiliar. The stalks do not sway and bend in a flowing wave the way they would if they were tall and flexible. Instead, they shiver, a short, stiff vibration that passes through the field like a tremor. The leaves rub against each other with that dry, scratchy sound, a sound that is more akin to the rustle of paper or the brushing of dry grass than to the lush, watery whisper of healthy grain. And with the wind comes the dust. The topsoil between the rows is so fine and so dry that the wind lifts it easily, picking up small particles and carrying them in tiny, swirling eddies that dance across the surface of the field. The dust settles on the wheat leaves, coating them with a fine, pale powder that dulls the already muted green even further. You can see the dust accumulating in the folds of the leaves, in the tiny hollows where the leaves meet the stem, a pale, grayish-brown film that covers everything like a thin layer of flour. You reach out and touch a leaf, and when you pull your finger away, the tip of it is coated with the fine dust, soft and dry and almost weightless. You stand up slowly, brushing the dust from your hands, and you look out across the field again. The overall impression is one of stillness, a kind of suspended animation in which the plants are not so much growing as they are waiting. The color of the field, that dusty, faded green, seems to absorb the sunlight rather than reflect it, and the landscape has a muted, almost monochrome quality, as if someone has laid a piece of fine gauze over the world and softened all the edges and all the colors. In the distance, at the far end of the field, there is a single tree, a large spreading oak that stands at the boundary between this field and the next. Its leaves are a deep, rich green, a color that seems impossibly vibrant compared to the pale wheat, and it draws your eye like a beacon. You begin to walk toward it, your boots crunching on the hard soil, the dry wheat stalks brushing against your shins with that faint, papery sound. As you walk, you notice the other signs of the dry season that are written on the land. The ground is not only cracked in small fissures. In some places, the cracks are wider and deeper, running for several feet in jagged lines that open into dark gaps. You step carefully over one of these larger cracks, and you can see that it goes down several inches into the earth, revealing a cross-section of the soil. The top layer is a pale, dusty brown, but just a few inches down, the color darkens, and there is a faint hint of coolness rising from the gap, a reminder that the deep earth still holds some memory of moisture even if the surface has forgotten it. A small beetle, black and shiny, emerges from the crack and scurries across the hard ground, its legs moving with a quick, mechanical precision, and then it disappears into another crack, vanishing as if it had never been there. You reach the oak tree, and you step into its shade with a feeling of relief that is almost physical. The difference in temperature is immediate and pronounced, the sun's heat replaced by a cool green shade that seems to wrap around you like a soft cloth. The ground under the tree is covered with a thick layer of last year's fallen leaves, a deep brown carpet that crunches under your boots in a way that is completely different from the hard thump of the bare field. The leaves are dry and curled, and they have a faint, pleasant smell, the smell of old wood and tannin and the slow work of decay. You lean your back against the rough bark of the trunk, feeling the solid, ancient weight of the tree behind you, and you look back the way you came. From here, the field of wheat looks like a pale, dusty carpet spread out under the sun, and the small, stiff plants are almost invisible as individual stalks, merging into a single, muted expanse of color. The wind is still moving, and you can see it now as a series of faint, shimmering ripples that pass over the field. But the sound of it is lost in the distance, reduced to a faint, dry hiss that barely reaches your ears. The oak tree itself is a world of sound, a sound that is the complete opposite of the wheat field. The leaves above you are dense and full, and they rustle with every breath of wind in a soft, continuous murmur that is like the sound of a distant stream. The leaves are a deep, glossy green, and they catch the sunlight and filter it into a dappled pattern of light and shadow that moves across the ground at your feet. An acorn, left over from last autumn, lies half buried in the leaf litter, its cap still attached, its shell a smooth, dark brown. You pick it up and turn it over in your fingers, feeling the cool, hard surface, the tiny point at the tip, the rough, scaly texture of the cap. It is a small, perfect thing, a promise of a future that is stored in a hard shell, waiting for the right conditions to begin its slow transformation into another tree. You stay in the shade of the oak for a long time, listening to the rustle of the leaves above you and the distant, dry whisper of the wheat field beyond. The heat of the day seems to press down on the land, a heavy, invisible weight that makes the air shimmer slightly in the distance. A hawk circles high overhead, its wings held wide and motionless as it rides the warm currents of air, and its shadow passes over the wheat field, a small dark shape that moves swiftly across the pale green surface. The hawk does not call out, it simply circles and watches, a patient observer of the dry world below. You watch it until it drifts away to the west, becoming a small dark speck that is eventually swallowed by the haze. When you finally step out from under the oak and begin to walk back through the wheat field, the sun feels even warmer than before, and the dust rises around your boots with every step, coating the lower leaves of the wheat plants with another thin layer of pale powder. You pause once more in the middle of the field, surrounded on all sides by the short, stiff stalks, and you close your eyes. The sound that comes to you is a quiet one, a sound made up of many small parts. The dry, papery rub of the wheat leaves, the soft hiss of the wind over the bare soil, the distant, muffled crow of a rooster from the village, and underneath it all, a deep, profound silence that is the sound of the land holding its breath, waiting for something that has not yet arrived. You open your eyes and look down at the wheat at your feet, at the tiny, furled heads that are hidden inside their dry sheaths, and you see the fine dust that coats every surface, a dust that is the color of old bone, and that will not wash away until the first real rain comes. Whenever that may be, you turn and continue your slow walk back toward the cart track, leaving the field behind you, the sound of the wheat that does not rustle fading slowly into the quiet of the afternoon. The afternoon sun has grown heavy and white, pressing down on the village and the fields with a weight that seems to make the very air thick and slow. You have walked back from the wheat field along the cart track, and now you find yourself drawn toward a patch of deep, welcome shadow at the edge of the hamlet. Here, at the boundary where the last house gives way to a rough, open area of packed earth and scattered wood piles, there stands an enormous oak tree. This is not the same oak you rested under before, but a different one, older and broader, its trunk so wide that two men with arms outstretched could barely touch fingertips around its girth. The bark is deeply furrowed, a landscape of ridges and valleys in dark grey and brown, and it is home to small patches of pale green lichen that spread in slow circles like maps of unknown countries. The branches spread outward and upward in a vast, irregular canopy, and the leaves, thick and dark and glossy, filter the harsh afternoon light into a soft, greenish gloom that seems to exist in a world separate from the bright, dusty glare just a few paces away. It is in this shade that the Cooper has set up his summer workshop. The Cooper is a man whose age is difficult to determine, his face browned and lined by sun and wind, his hands large and knotted with the kind of strength that comes from decades of gripping tools and shaping wood. He wears a simple tunic of undyed linen, the sleeves rolled up past his elbows to reveal forearms that are corded with muscle and marked with small pale scars. The history of 1,000 slips of the draw knife and the careless brush of a sharp stave edge. He sits on a low, three-legged stool that has been worn to a smooth polish on its seat, and before him rests a long, heavy workbench made of thick planks of oak, its surface scarred and gouged and stained with the dark patina of years of labor. Around him, arranged in careful, purposeful disorder, are the materials and tools of his trade. There are bundles of long, curved wooden staves, stacked neatly against the trunk of the oak, their pale, freshly split surfaces catching the filtered light. There is a collection of iron hoops, some large and some small, leaning against the bench in a jumbled, clattering pile, their surfaces mottled with a fine orange rust that flakes off in tiny particles when they are moved. There are wooden mallets with heads shaped like thick cylinders and handles worn smooth and dark. There are draw knives with long curved blades and two wooden handles, and there are chisels and planes and measuring tools whose names you do not know but whose purposes you can guess by their shapes. You find a place to sit on a large flat stone at the edge of the shade, a stone that is cool and slightly damped to the touch, covered on one side with a soft cushion of dark green moss. From here, you can watch the Cooper without being in his way, and you can let the slow, repetitive rhythm of his work wash over you like the gentle sound of the wind in the oak leaves above. The Cooper does not acknowledge your presence, or if he does, he gives no sign of it. His attention is fixed entirely on the piece of wood in his hands, a single stave that he has selected from the pile. He holds it up to the light, turning it slowly, examining its curve and its grain with the careful, assessing eye of someone who sees not just a piece of wood, but a potential shape, a future function hidden within the fibers. The stave is made of oak, like everything else here. It is about 3 feet long, perhaps a little more, and it is curved along its length in a gentle, sweeping arc. The outer surface, the side that will eventually face the world, is rough and splintered, still bearing the marks of the wedge and the froe that split it from the larger log. The inner surface, the side that will hold the wine or the grain, is smoother, planed down to a pale, even finish that shows the fine, straight grain of the wood, a series of parallel lines that run the length of the stave like the contour lines on a map of a gentle hill. The Cooper runs his thumb along this inner surface, feeling for any irregularities, any small bumps or dips that might cause a leak or a weak spot. Finding none, he sets the stave down on the bench and reaches for another, repeating the process with the same slow, methodical care. He does this for perhaps a dozen staves, building a small pile of selected pieces on the bench beside him, each one examined and approved before being added to the stack. When he has enough staves, he picks up his draw knife. The tool is a beautiful thing in its own way, a long curved blade of dark iron that tapers to 2 wooden handles set at right angles to the blade. The edge of the blade catches the light with a thin, bright line, a gleam that speaks of recent sharpening and careful maintenance. The Cooper grips the 2 handles firmly, his knuckles whitening slightly with the pressure, and he positions the first stave on the bench, holding it in place with a wooden clamp that is itself a simple but ingenious device, a block of wood with a wedge that can be tapped tight with a mallet. He leans forward, his body settling into a posture of focused attention, and he draws the knife toward himself along the outer curve of the stave. The sound that the draw knife makes is a sound that belongs entirely to this place and this moment. It is a long, continuous shushing sound, a sound that is part scrape and part whisper, the sound of a sharp blade slicing through the soft, fibrous surface of the oak. A thin, curling shaving of wood rises from the blade, pale and translucent, curling back on itself like a lock of fine, blonde hair. It falls away from the stave and drifts down to the ground, landing on the growing pile of shavings that has already accumulated at the cooper's feet. The pile is a soft, tangled mound of cream and gold and pale brown, and it gives off a faint, sweet smell, the smell of fresh cut oak, a smell that is clean and dry and slightly spicy, like the memory of a forest in high summer. The cooper works his way down the length of the stave, stroke after stroke, each one removing a thin layer of wood, each one followed by the soft fall of another curled shaving. His movements are slow and even, almost mechanical in their regularity, but there is nothing stiff or robotic about them. There is a fluidity to his work, a kind of practiced ease that comes from having done this same motion tens of thousands of times over the course of a long life. The draw knife never catches or digs in too deep. It glides over the wood with a smooth, steady pressure, guided by hands that know exactly how much force to apply and at what angle. You watch the stave transform under his hands, the rough, splintered outer surface giving way to a smoother, more refined curve, the color of the wood lightening from a weathered grey-brown to a warm, honeyed gold. When the outer curve is shaped to his satisfaction, the cooper releases the clamp and turns the stave over, repositioning it so that he can work on the edges. The edges of a barrel stave are beveled at specific angles so that they will fit tightly together with their neighbors, forming a watertight seal. The cooper uses a different tool for this, a long, flat plane with a wooden body and a sharp iron blade that protrudes just a fraction of an inch from the sole. He runs this plane along the edge of the stave with a series of short, precise strokes, each one removing a tiny curl of wood, each one followed by a pause as he sights down the edge to check his progress. The sound of the plane is different from the sound of the draw knife, a higher, sharper hiss like the sound of tearing silk. The shavings that fall from the plane are thinner and finer, almost transparent, and they float down to the pile like small, pale feathers. The cooper works on the stave for a long time, shaping and smoothing and checking and adjusting. The heat of the afternoon seems to have no effect on him. He does not hurry and he does not slow down. He works a steady, unchanging pace, a pace that is dictated not by the sun or the hour, but by the nature of the wood and the requirements of the task. When the first stave is finished, he sets it aside and picks up the next one, and the process begins again. The same sounds, the same motions, the same careful attention to the grain and the curve. The pile of finished staves grows slowly, one by one, and the pile of shavings at his feet grows deeper and softer. After a time, a young boy comes out from one of the houses, carrying a clay cup of water. He approaches the cooper quietly, respectfully, and he holds out the cup without speaking. The cooper looks up, his hands pausing in their work for the first time since you sat down. He takes the cup with a small nod, and he drinks the water slowly, his throat moving with each swallow. When the cup is empty, he hands it back to the boy, who takes it and retreats back to the house without a word. The cooper wipes his mouth with the back of his hand, picks up the draw knife, and resumes his work. The interruption has lasted perhaps 30 seconds, and it has not disturbed the rhythm of the afternoon in any noticeable way. The sun moves slowly across the sky, and the shadow of the oak tree shifts gradually across the ground. The patch of shade where you are sitting has moved a few inches since you first arrived, and you find yourself adjusting your position slightly to remain in the cool, green darkness. The cooper, however, does not move. His bench is positioned in a spot that will remain shaded for most of the afternoon, a spot he has chosen with the same care and foresight that he applies to his staves. The light that filters through the leaves above him dapples his hands and his tools with shifting patterns of gold and green, and the shavings on the ground catch the light in a way that makes them look like piles of thin, curled gold leaf. The cooper has finished shaping all the staves for a single barrel. Now he begins the process of assembly. He takes a heavy iron hoop, one of the smaller ones from the pile, and he places it on the ground. Then he begins to arrange the finished staves inside this hoop, standing them on end, their beveled edges fitting together in a circle. It is a delicate operation, requiring patience and a gentle touch. The staves want to fall over, to slip out of alignment, and the cooper works slowly, adjusting and readjusting, tapping them lightly with a wooden mallet to nudge them into place. The sound of the mallet against the wood is a soft, hollow thok, a sound that is repeated many times as the circle of staves gradually takes shape. When all the staves are in place, standing upright and forming a rough, flared cylinder, the cooper taps another iron hoop down over the top, using the mallet to drive it slowly and evenly down the widening shape. The iron hoop scrapes against the wood with a low, grating sound, a sound that is harsh but somehow satisfying, the sound of something being made tight and secure. The barrel, even at this early stage, is a beautiful object. The staves flare outward slightly at the middle and taper inward at the ends, creating a shape that is both practical and pleasing to the eye, a shape that has been refined over centuries of coopering tradition. The wood, now that the staves are pressed tightly together, shows a continuous band of grain that wraps around the circumference, interrupted only by the dark lines of the seams where the staves meet. The cooper runs his hand over the outside of the barrel, feeling the smoothness of the wood, checking for any gaps or misalignments. He finds none, or if he does, he corrects them with a few more taps of the mallet, the sound echoing softly in the shade. The afternoon wears on, and the cooper continues his work. He will need to shape the inside of the barrel, a process that involves special curved planes and a great deal of patience. He will need to cut the grooves near the ends, called the crows, where the barrel heads will fit. He will need to shape the heads themselves, flat circles of wood made from several pieces joined together with wooden dowels. And he will need to char the inside of the barrel over a small fire, a process that will darken the wood and give it the smoky character that will flavor the wine or the grain that it will eventually hold. But all of that is for later, for another afternoon, for another long, slow session in the shade of the oak tree. For now, the cooper pauses in his work, setting down his tools and straightening his back with a slow, careful motion. He looks at the barrel taking shape before him, and his face is calm and satisfied, the face of a man who has done good work and who will do more good work tomorrow. He picks up a handful of the shavings from the pile at his feet, and he lets them fall through his fingers, watching them drift and settle. The smell of the fresh oak rises around him, clean and dry and faintly sweet. The sun has moved further across the sky, and the light that reaches under the oak tree is now a deep, rich gold, the color of honey or of the wood shavings themselves. You remain sitting on your cool stone, feeling the slow, steady peace of the afternoon settle over you like a soft blanket, and you listen to the quiet sounds of the village beginning to stir as the hottest part of the day gives way to the long, slow approach of evening. You have left the shade of the cooper's oak and the quiet sounds of his mallet, and now you are walking along a narrow path that leads away from the village and down toward the river. The path descends gently, winding between patches of dry grass and the occasional clump of wild thyme that releases a faint, dusty fragrance when your boots brush against it. The afternoon is well advanced, and the light has taken on a softer, more golden quality, the harsh white glare of midday giving way to a warmth that seems to settle over the land like a thin layer of honey. The air is still and quiet, and the only sounds are the soft crunch of your footsteps and the distant, intermittent call of a bird that you cannot see. The path curves around a low hill, and as you come around the bend, the river comes into view. The Loire at this point in its long journey across the heart of France is usually a broad, generous waterway, a wide ribbon of silvery green that moves with a steady, unhurried current, carrying the meltwater from the distant mountains and the rain from 1,000 tributaries toward the distant sea. In a normal year, in the late spring, the river would be full and lively, its surface ruffled by small waves and swirling eddies, its voice a constant, murmuring presence that could be heard from a long way off. But this is not a normal year, and the river that lies before you now is a different creature entirely. It is still broad, but its breadth is now more a matter of exposed riverbed than of flowing water. The banks have widened, retreating from the center channel and leaving behind great expanses of pale sand and smooth, rounded pebbles that have not seen the touch of water for many weeks. The river itself has shrunk, pulling back into the deepest part of its channel, and what remains is a narrow, sluggish stream that moves so slowly it seems almost to be standing still. You walk down the gentle slope of the bank, your boots sinking slightly into the loose, dry sand. The sand is a pale, creamy color, almost white in the bright sun, and it is marked everywhere with the tracks of birds, the delicate three-toed prints of small wading birds that have come to probe the shallows for whatever tiny creatures might still be living there. The sand is warm underfoot, and it shifts and slides with each step, making a soft, sighing sound. You stoop down and pick up a handful of it, letting it run through your fingers in a fine, dry stream. It is warm and weightless, and it leaves a faint, pale residue on your palm, a dust that is the powdered remains of ancient stones ground down by centuries of water that is no longer here. Beyond the band of dry sand, you come to the pebbles. They cover a wide stretch of the former riverbed, a vast undulating field of rounded stones in every shade of grey and brown and black, with here and there a flash of white quartz or a speckle of rusty red. The pebbles are smooth and cool to the touch despite the sun, worn into perfect ovals and spheres by the patient work of the current that once tumbled them against each other day and night. Now they lie still and silent, packed together in a dense mosaic, their surfaces dry and slightly dusty. A few of them are covered with a thin, crunchy layer of dried algae, a pale greenish-brown crust that flakes off when you touch it, revealing the dark, damp stone beneath. The algae is a reminder that these stones were underwater not so long ago, that the river once covered this entire expanse with its flowing, living presence. Now the algae is dead and dry, and it crumbles into a fine powder that mingles with the sand. You continue walking toward the water's edge, stepping carefully over the uneven bed of pebbles. The sound of your footsteps here is different, a hard, clacking sound as stone strikes against stone, a sound that echoes slightly in the stillness. The air near the river is cooler than the air up on the bank, and it carries a smell that is distinct and memorable, the smell of river water that is low and warm and full of life. It is a smell of mud and fish and rotting vegetation, but it is not unpleasant. It is the earthy, organic smell of a living ecosystem, a smell that speaks of the deep, slow processes of the natural world. It mingles with the dry scent of the warm pebbles and the faint, clean smell of the water itself. You reach the edge of the flowing water, and you stop, looking out across the diminished river. The water is clear, far clearer than it would be in a season of high flow, when it would be clouded with silt and debris. Here, in the slow, shallow current, you can see all the way to the bottom. The riverbed is covered with more pebbles, these ones dark and glistening with moisture, and there are patches of soft green aquatic plants that wave gently in the almost imperceptible flow. The water moves so slowly that it barely disturbs the reflections on its surface. Looking across to the far bank, you can see the image of the trees and the sky mirrored with an almost perfect fidelity, the only distortions being the faint, slow ripples that spread out from a small, unseen insect landing on the surface. The reflection of a willow tree on the opposite bank hangs upside down in the water, its long trailing branches reaching down into the reflected sky, and the image is so clear and so still that it is difficult to tell where the real tree ends and the reflected one begins. In the shallows near your feet, a small school of tiny fish, no longer than your thumb, hovers in the clear water. They are silver and quick, and they dart from side to side in sudden, synchronized movements, their bodies flashing like small mirrors as they catch the light. They are gathered near a patch of the green aquatic weed, finding shade and perhaps food among the soft, waving fronds. You watch them for a long time, the way they move together, as if they share a single mind, the way they scatter and then regroup, the way their tiny mouths open and close in a constant, silent rhythm. The water around them is so clear that they seem to be suspended in air, floating in a transparent medium that is barely there. Further out, in the middle of the channel, where the water is deeper and the current, such as it is, makes itself known, you see the heron. The bird is standing perfectly still in the shallows, its long, thin legs looking like two reeds that have taken root in the riverbed. Its plumage is a soft, muted grey, the colour of the pebbles and the overcast sky, and its neck is folded back into a tight S-curve, its head held low and motionless. The heron is watching the water with an intensity that is almost palpable. Its eyes, small and dark and utterly focused, fixed on some point just below the surface. You watch the heron, and the heron watches the water, and for a long, suspended moment, nothing moves. The bird is a statue, a living piece of the landscape, so still and so patient that it seems to have become one with the river itself. The only sign that it is alive is the occasional slow blink of its eye, a movement so small and so deliberate that you almost miss it. Then, with a sudden fluid motion that is over almost before it begins, the heron's head darts down into the water, emerging a fraction of a second later with a small silver fish wriggling in its long, sharp beak. The bird tilts its head back, and the fish disappears down its throat in a single smooth gulp. Then the heron resumes its motionless vigil, as if nothing has happened, as if the small drama of life and death that just played out was merely a ripple in the long, slow current of the afternoon. You leave the heron to its patient work and walk a little way upstream along the exposed bank. The pebbles give way to a stretch of dried mud, a surface that was once the soft, silty bottom of the river but is now baked hard and cracked by the sun. The mud is dried into a complex pattern of interlocking polygons, each one about the size of your hand, their edges curled upwards slightly like the pages of an old, neglected book. The cracks between the polygons are deep and dark, and in some of them you can see the tiny, dried remains of aquatic snails, their delicate spiral shells bleached white by the sun. You step carefully over the cracked mud, and it makes a hollow, crunchy sound under your boots, the sound of a surface that is brittle and empty beneath. You come to a place where a large, flat rock juts out into the riverbed, a shelf of dark grey stone that has been scoured smooth by centuries of flowing water. The rock is warm from the sun, and it is covered in places with a thin, dry film of the same pale dust that coats everything in this season. You sit down on the rock, letting your legs dangle over the edge, your feet just above the surface of the water. From here, you have a long, clear view up and down the river. Looking upstream, you can see the gentle curve of the river as it disappears around a wooded bend. The trees on the banks are a mix of deep green willows and pale green poplars, their leaves hanging limp and still in the motionless air. Looking downstream, you can see a similar view, the river winding away into the distance, growing narrower and more distant until it is just a thin silver thread lost in the haze. The sound of the river is so faint that you have to listen carefully to hear it. It is not the rushing, gurgling sound of a healthy stream, but a soft, continuous whisper, the sound of water moving slowly over and around the stones in its path. It is a sound that is almost like breathing, a gentle, rhythmic susurrus that rises and falls with the faintest variations in the current. If you close your eyes, you can almost imagine that the river is speaking to you in a language so old and so quiet that it has no words, only the sound of water touching stone, over and over, without end. You open your eyes and look down into the water directly below you. The rock you are sitting on extends a little way under the surface, and you can see the dark, wavering shape of it through the clear water. A few small plants grow in the crevices of the rock, their leaves a bright, vivid green that stands out against the dark stone. A single water beetle, black and shiny, skates across the surface, its legs dimpling the water with tiny circular depressions that spread out and disappear. The beetle moves in short, jerky bursts, pausing between each burst as if it is thinking about where to go next. It reminds you of the cooper's mallet, the way it would pause between strokes, and the thought drifts through your mind like a leaf on the current. The memory of the river as it used to be comes to you not as a vivid emotional recollection, but as a quiet, factual comparison, the way one might compare the height of the well water from one month to the next. You remember the sound of it in a wet spring, the way the water would rush against the banks with a low, continuous roar, the way it would carry branches and leaves and the occasional uprooted sapling downstream in a swirling, chaotic dance. You remember the feel of the current pulling at your legs if you waded in, the cold, insistent pressure of the moving water, the way the riverbed would shift and change under your feet. You remember the color of it, a rich, opaque, greenish-brown, the color of the soil it carried from the fields upstream. All of that is a memory now, a memory that lies as still and quiet as the pebbles on the dry bank, waiting for the return of the rains that will wake it up again. A light breeze stirs, moving across the surface of the water and creating a patch of small, glittering ripples that travel downstream for a few feet before fading back into stillness. The breeze touches your face, and it is warm and dry, carrying the scent of the dry grass and the warm stone. It rustles the leaves of the willows on the far bank, a soft, papery sound that is answered by a similar rustle from the poplars behind you. The breeze dies as quickly as it came, and the river returns to its glassy stillness, the reflections reforming into perfect inverted images of the world above. A pair of ducks comes into view, swimming slowly downstream. They are mallards, the male with his glossy green head and the female with her mottled brown plumage, and they move with a calm, unhurried grace, their feet paddling invisibly beneath the surface. They leave behind them a V-shaped wake that spreads out and gradually disappears, the only disturbance on the otherwise smooth water. The ducks do not seem to mind the low water. They paddle along contentedly, occasionally dipping their heads under the surface to forage for whatever they can find. Their movements are slow and peaceful, and they drift past you and continue on around the bend, vanishing from sight as quietly as they appeared. The sun has moved further toward the west, and the light is now a deep, rich gold that casts long, soft shadows across the exposed riverbed. The pebbles glow with a warm, internal light, and the dry mud takes on the color of old copper. The water itself reflects the golden sky, turning from clear green to a shimmering sheet of pale gold and soft pink. The heron is still there, still motionless, but now its grey plumage is touched with the warm light, and it looks like a creature carved from stone and then gilded by the setting sun. You watch the heron for a long time, and the heron watches the water, and the river whispers its quiet, endless whisper. When you finally rise from the warm rock and begin to make your way back up the bank, your shadow stretches out long and thin before you, a dark, silent companion that moves across the pale sand and the dark pebbles. The sound of your footsteps is the only sound now, the soft crunch of sand giving way to the hard clack of stones. You pause at the top of the bank and look back one more time. The river lies below you, a narrow ribbon of gold in the fading light, surrounded by the wide, pale expanse of its former bed. It is still and quiet, a river that has shrunk into itself, holding its breath and waiting for the season to turn. The memory of the current is there, written in the smooth stones and the cracked mud, a memory that will become reality again when the rains finally come. But for now, there is only the slow, patient stillness, and the soft whispering voice of the water that remains, a voice that will continue through the night and into the next day, quiet and constant, a lullaby for the dry and weary land. The morning has arrived with a pale, diffuse light that filters through the small, high windows of the village bakehouse. You have come here from the coolness of the early air outside, stepping through a low wooden door that is warped with age and heat, its surface darkened by years of smoke and the touch of many hands. The interior is a single room, not large, but arranged with a careful, purposeful economy that speaks of generations of use. The walls are of the same rough local stone as the houses, but here they are coated with a thin layer of fine white lime wash that has yellowed and cracked over time, forming a delicate network of hairline fissures that spread across the surface like the map of some forgotten river system. The floor is made of packed earth, worn smooth and hard by countless footsteps, and it slopes gently toward a low drain in one corner where water from the washing of bowls and hands can find its way out. The air inside the bakehouse is different from the air outside, warmer by several degrees even though the fire has not yet been lit for the day, and it carries a smell that is both complex and deeply familiar, the dry, dusty scent of old flour that has settled into every crack and crevice over the years, mingled with the faint, sweet ghost of 1,000 loaves of bread baked long ago. In the center of the far wall, dominating the small room, stands the oven. It is a large domed structure built of the same pale limestone, its surface blackened and streaked with the soot of countless fires. The mouth of the oven is a low, arched opening, just wide enough to admit a long-handled wooden peel and tall enough to slide in a loaf of bread without it touching the top. The floor of the oven, which you can see as a dark, shadowed space beyond the arch, is made of smooth, fire-blackened brick, laid in a tight, circular pattern that radiates outward from the center. The bricks are worn to a glassy smoothness in places, polished by the sliding of bread and the scraping of ashes. Above the arch, set into the stonework, there is a small rectangular niche that holds a bundle of dried rosemary and a small clay figure, a simple rounded shape that might be a saint or might be nothing more than a token of good fortune, placed there so long ago that no one remembers exactly why. In front of the oven, on the packed earth floor, there is a wide, shallow pit lined with flat stones, and it is here that the fire will be built, the flames and the heat drawn into the domed chamber to soak into the brick and stone before the embers are raked out and the bread is put in to bake. The baker is a woman of middle years, her hair covered with a simple linen cloth that is tied at the nape of her neck, her hands dusted with a fine white powder that has worked its way into the lines and creases of her skin. She moves around the bakehouse with the same kind of slow, practiced economy that you observed in the cooper under his oak tree, each motion deliberate and unhurried, each task flowing into the next, without any sense of rush or urgency. She is preparing the oven for the day's baking, and the first step in this long, quiet ritual is the laying of the fire. You find a place to sit on a low wooden bench that is pushed against one wall, its surface worn to a smooth, dark polish by the backs and thighs of those who have sat here before you. From this vantage point, you can watch the baker's work without being in her way, and you can let the warmth of the room and the slow, rhythmic nature of her tasks settle over you like a soft, heavy blanket. The baker does not speak, nor does she seem to notice your presence. Her attention is fixed on the materials before her, a pile of kindling, thin, dry twigs and splinters of pine that have been gathered from the forest floor and stored in a dry corner, a bundle of dried grapevines that have been saved from the pruning of the vineyard, their twisted woody stems as thick as your finger and covered with a peeling, papery bark, and a stack of larger logs, split and seasoned oak that has been drying under a lean-to for at least 2 full years. The wood is a pale grey-brown, its ends checked with small radial cracks, and it gives off a faint, clean smell of dry timber. The baker kneels before the oven mouth and begins to arrange the kindling in the fire pit. She works with a slow, careful precision, laying the thinnest twigs in a loose, airy pile, then adding slightly larger sticks in a crisscross pattern that will allow the air to flow freely through the growing structure. Her hands move with a gentle, almost tender touch, as if she is tucking a child into bed rather than building a fire. The kindling makes small, dry clicking sounds as the pieces are placed, a sound that is like the ticking of a very slow clock. When the kindling is arranged to her satisfaction, she reaches for the bundle of dried grapevines. These she places on top of the kindling, their gnarled, twisted shapes creating a framework that will catch the flames and hold them long enough to ignite the larger logs. The grapevines have a faint, spicy smell, a memory of the sun and the soil of the vineyard, and as she handles them, small flakes of the dry bark drift down and settle on the hearthstones. Next, the baker selects a piece of flint and a small, curved piece of steel from a niche beside the oven. She holds the flint in her left hand, the steel in her right, and she strikes the steel against the flint with a short, sharp motion. A small shower of orange sparks flies from the point of impact, brief and bright, and most of them fade and die before they reach the kindling. She strikes again and again, each time producing the same small burst of sparks, each time leaning in a little closer to watch their path. On the 4th or 5th strike, a single spark lands on a particularly dry and fluffy piece of the kindling, a small tuft of shredded bark that she has placed there for just this purpose. The spark glows for a moment, a tiny orange-red point of light, and then a thin wisp of smoke begins to rise from it. The baker leans in closer, her lips pursed, and she blows a gentle, steady stream of air onto the glowing spark. The smoke thickens, and then, with a soft, almost silent puff, a small flame appears. It is a pale, flickering yellow at first, barely visible, but as she continues to blow gently, it grows stronger and brighter, spreading from the tuft of bark to the surrounding twigs. The fire has been born. The flames move through the kindling with a soft, crackling sound, a sound that is like the rustle of dry leaves, magnified and made sharper. The thin twigs blacken and curl, and the fire leaps upward, finding the grapevines and wrapping itself around them. The grapevines catch with a louder, more vigorous crackle, and the flames change color, becoming a brighter, cleaner yellow, with occasional flashes of pale blue at their base. The heat from the fire begins to radiate outward, warming your face and your hands, and the smell of the burning wood fills the bakehouse. a smell that is both sharp and sweet, the smell of pine resin and oak tannin, and the faint, fruity ghost of the grapes that once grew on those twisted vines. The smoke rises in a thin, grey column, drawn by the shape of the oven into the domed chamber, where it swirls and eddies for a moment before finding its way out through the small vent hole at the top of the dome. The vent is a simple round opening, no larger than your fist, and through it you can see a small patch of the pale morning sky. The baker adds the larger logs, placing them carefully on top of the burning grapevines. The oak logs are heavy and dense, and they take longer to catch. For a while they simply sit on the fire, their surfaces darkening and beginning to steam as the moisture trapped deep within the wood is driven out by the heat. Then, slowly, small flames begin to lick at their edges, finding purchase in the rough bark and the checked ends, and soon the logs are burning steadily, their surfaces glowing a deep, rich red beneath the flickering yellow flames. The fire is now fully established, a living, breathing thing that fills the bakehouse with its warmth and its sound and its smell. The baker sits back on her heels, wiping her hands on her apron, and she watches the fire with a calm, assessing gaze, the same kind of gaze that the cooper directed at his staves, the same kind of gaze that the farmer directed at the dry soil. The fire will burn for a long time, perhaps 2 hours or more, until the dome of the oven is thoroughly heated and the bricks of the floor are too hot to touch. The baker knows exactly how long to let it burn, not by any clock or timepiece, but by the color of the soot on the dome and the sound of the heat radiating from the stones. While the fire does its work, she turns to the other task of the morning, the preparation of the dough. Against the opposite wall, away from the heat of the oven, there stands a large, heavy table made of thick planks of beechwood. The surface of the table is smooth and pale, scrubbed clean every day with water and a stiff brush, and it bears the faint, circular stains of countless loaves of bread that have been shaped upon it. On the table rests a large, deep wooden trough, carved from a single piece of chestnut, its interior darkened and smoothed by years of use. Beside the trough sits a large clay jar, taller than your knee and wider than your shoulders can encompass. Its surface a warm, unglazed terracotta that is cool and slightly rough to the touch. This jar holds the flour that has been milled from the grain that was harvested last summer and stored in the granary through the autumn and the winter and the spring. The baker lifts the heavy wooden lid from the clay jar and sets it aside. The smell that rises from the jar is the smell of the flour, a smell that is dry and faintly sweet, with an earthy undertone that speaks of the field and the sun and the long months of storage. She reaches inside with a large wooden scoop, and she begins to measure the flour into the trough. The scoop is a simple bowl-shaped piece of wood with a short handle, worn smooth and dark with use. Each scoopful of flour falls into the trough with a soft, muffled thump, and a small cloud of fine, white dust rises into the air, catching the light from the fire and the high windows and hanging there for a moment before slowly settling. The flour is not the pure, snowy white of the finest wheat. It is a darker, warmer color, a creamy beige with flecks of pale brown and gray, the bran and the germ that the miller's stone did not entirely separate from the endosperm. It is a rougher flour, a more honest flour, and it has a texture that is slightly gritty when you rub a pinch of it between your fingers. The baker measures out the flour with a slow, steady rhythm, scoop after scoop, until the trough holds a deep, soft mound of it. She then makes a hollow in the center of the mound, a small, round depression like the crater of a tiny volcano, and into this hollow she pours a measure of water from a clay pitcher. The water is cool and clear, drawn from the village well just this morning, and it soaks into the flour with a soft, hissing sound, darkening the creamy beige to a warm, wet brown. Next, she adds a small amount of the sourdough starter that she has kept alive in a small clay pot, a bubbling, fragrant mass of flour and water and wild yeast that has been nurtured and fed for longer than anyone can remember. The starter is a pale grayish beige, and it has a sharp, tangy smell that cuts through the dry scent of the flour, a smell that is both slightly sour and pleasantly yeasty, the smell of fermentation and transformation. Finally, she adds a generous pinch of coarse grey salt from a small wooden box, the salt crystals glittering in the firelight like tiny, irregular diamonds. The baker plunges her hands into the trough, and the slow, rhythmic work of kneading begins. Her hands move in a steady, circular motion, folding the flour and the water and the starter and the salt together, pressing and turning and folding again. The sound of the kneading is a soft, wet, squelching sound, punctuated by the occasional thump as the mass of dough is turned and slapped against the side of the trough. The dough is stiff at first, resisting her efforts, but as she works, it begins to change. It becomes smoother and more elastic, transforming from a ragged, shaggy mass into a cohesive, glossy ball that clings to itself and pulls away from the sides of the trough. The baker's hands are coated with a thin layer of the dough, and she pauses occasionally to scrape them clean with a small wooden paddle, adding the scrapings back into the main mass. The work is repetitive and meditative, a slow, steady rhythm that is as old as the village itself. When the dough has reached the right consistency, a state that only the baker's experienced hands can truly judge, she covers the trough with a clean linen cloth and leaves it to rest. The dough will rise slowly in the warmth of the bakehouse, the wild yeasts from the starter feeding on the starches in the flour and producing tiny bubbles of gas that will cause the mass to swell and soften. This process will take several hours, and during that time, the baker will tend to the fire, adding a log when necessary, adjusting the position of the embers with a long iron poker, and watching the color of the oven dome change from black to a pale, ghostly gray, and then to a pure, glowing white. You sit on your bench and watch as the baker goes about these quiet tasks. The fire has burnt down now, the large oak logs reduced to a bed of glowing orange-red embers that radiate a steady, intense heat. The dome of the oven is no longer black with soot. The intense heat has burned the soot away, leaving the stone a pale, clean gray that seems almost to glow with its own internal light. The baker takes up a long-handled iron rake, its wooden handle worn smooth and dark, and she carefully rakes the embers out of the oven mouth, pulling them into the fire pit in front of the arch. The embers tumble and shift, sending up a shower of bright sparks that swirl upward and fade into the dim air. The heat that comes from the open oven mouth is intense, a dry, baking heat that you can feel on your face even from across the room, and it carries the clean, mineral smell of superheated stone. With the embers removed, the baker takes a damp cloth tied to the end of a long pole, and she swabs out the floor of the oven, removing the last traces of ash and creating a brief, hissing cloud of steam. The floor is now clean and smooth, a dark, heat-radiating surface that is ready to receive the bread. She returns to the trough and lifts the linen cloth. The dough has risen, its surface smooth and domed and slightly tacky to the touch. She cuts a piece of the dough with a wooden scraper, weighing it in her hands with the practiced feel of someone who has done this 1,000 times, and she begins to shape it into a round, smooth ball. Her hands move in a gentle cupping motion, tucking the edges of the dough under and rotating it against the wooden table until it forms a tight, even sphere. She places the shaped loaf on a wooden peel that has been dusted with a fine layer of coarse flour, and she repeats the process, shaping loaf after loaf with the same slow, careful precision. When the peel is full, she carries it to the oven. The peel is a long, flat wooden paddle with a thin, tapered edge, and she slides it into the oven mouth with a smooth, practiced motion, positioning the loaves on the hot, brick floor. The dough sizzles faintly as it touches the hot surface, a brief, quiet sound that is immediately swallowed by the intense, dry heat of the oven. She withdraws the peel, leaving the loaves inside, and she closes the oven mouth with a large flat stone that has been fitted to the arch. The bakehouse falls into a different kind of quiet now, a quiet that is filled with a faint, distant sound of the bread baking, a sound that is more of a feeling than an actual noise, the sound of heat and transformation. The smell that begins to fill the bakehouse is the smell of baking bread, a smell that is warm and yeasty and slightly sweet, with a toasty, nutty undertone as the crust begins to brown. It is a smell that wraps around you like a soft blanket, a smell that speaks of nourishment and comfort and the simple, essential rhythms of life. You close your eyes and let the warmth and the smell wash over you, and you listen to the quiet sounds of the bakehouse, the soft crackle of the dying embers in the fire pit, the faint hiss of steam escaping from the vent at the top of the dome, and the slow, steady breathing of the baker as she sits on a low stool, waiting for the bread to be done. The morning has passed, and the afternoon is well underway, and the bread bakes on in the quiet, patient heat, turning from pale dough to golden, crusty loaves that will feed the village for another day. You have left the village behind once more, stepping out onto the long, pale road that leads to the market town of Sawmore. The hour is early, the sun not yet fully risen above the low hills to the east, and the world is still wrapped in that soft, colorless light that comes just before dawn, a light that seems to drain the landscape of its vividness and leave behind only gentle shapes and muted tones. The road before you is a wide, unpaved track of hard-packed earth and crushed stone, a road that has been traveled for centuries by carts and wagons and the feet of countless people and animals, and its surface is worn smooth and pale, almost white in the dim light. This is the road they call the White Road, not because it is made of anything white, but because the constant passage of wheels and hooves has ground the surface stone into a fine, pale dust that coats everything and reflects the light in a way that seems to glow faintly, even under an overcast sky. Today the sky is clear, and the road stretches out before you like a pale ribbon laid across the gently rolling countryside, disappearing into the distance where the morning haze still clings to the low ground. You are not walking alone, though you are not exactly walking with company in the sense of conversation or shared purpose. You are following, at a short distance, a cart. The cart is a simple, sturdy vehicle made of weathered oak and iron, its two large wheels standing almost as tall as a man's shoulder, their wooden spokes radiating from a heavy iron hub. The wheels are bound with iron tires, thick bands of dark metal that have been hammered onto the wooden rims and that shine dully in the growing light where they have been polished by contact with the road. The cart bed is a flat, rectangular platform of thick planks with low wooden sides that are held in place by iron brackets. And at the front, a long wooden shaft extends forward attached to the yoke that rests across the broad shoulders of a single ox. The ox is a large, placid animal of a dusty brown color, its hide marked with darker patches around the eyes and on the muzzle, its horns curving outward and then inward in a smooth, symmetrical arc. The ox moves at a pace that is almost impossible to measure, a pace so slow that if you were to fix your eyes on a single stone by the side of the road, you would have to wait a long time to see the cart pass it. This is the pace of the ox, a pace that is not dictated by human impatience or the demands of a schedule, but by the deep, internal rhythm of the animal itself, a rhythm that is as old and as steady as the turning of the earth. The driver of the cart is a man whose age is difficult to guess, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat of felt that has softened and lost its shape over years of use. He does not ride in the cart, for the load, though meager, is enough for the ox to pull without the added burden of a human passenger. And besides, walking alongside is what he has always done. He walks on the left side of the ox, one hand resting lightly on the wooden shaft, not to guide the animal, which knows the way as well as he does, but simply because that is where his hand falls naturally. His footsteps are slow and even, matching the pace of the ox, and his boots make a soft, scuffing sound on the dusty road. He wears a loose tunic of undyed wool and heavy breeches, and over his shoulder is slung a leather bag that contains a piece of hard bread and a small clay bottle of water. He does not speak to the ox, and the ox does not require speaking to. They move together in a silence that is comfortable and complete, a partnership built on years of these slow journeys along this same white road. You fall into step behind the cart, keeping a distance of perhaps 20 paces, close enough to hear the sounds of its passage, but far enough back to avoid the worst of the dust that rises from the wheels and the ox's hooves. The sound of the cart is a complex and layered thing, a slow, rhythmic composition made up of several distinct parts. There is the creak of the wooden axle turning in its greased iron bearings, a sound that is low and groaning, with a slight repetitive squeak that occurs at exactly the same point in each rotation of the wheels. There is the soft, rhythmic thud of the ox's hooves on the packed earth, a sound that is 4 distinct beats, followed by a pause, over and over, a slow, steady heartbeat of the journey. There is the jingle of the iron chain that connects the yoke to the cart shaft, a light, metallic sound that seems almost musical in the quiet of the early morning. And there is the faint, continuous rustle of the cart's contents, the small sounds of the meager load shifting and settling with each bump and sway of the wheels. You look at the load in the cart as you walk behind it. It is not a large load, not the kind of abundant harvest that would fill a cart to overflowing and require a team of 2 or even 4 oxen to pull. It is a modest collection of goods, the surplus of a dry season, gathered together for the journey to the market town, where they might be traded for things that cannot be made or grown on the farm. There is a bundle of thin flax. The stalks are pale silvery grey, tied together with a twist of hemp twine. The flax is being retted and dried and is ready to be spun into thread, and it rustles softly with a sound like fine paper whenever the cart hits a small bump. There is a small cask of honey, no larger than a water bucket. Its wooden staves dark with age and sticky around the bung, and the sweet, heavy scent of it drifts back to you in faint waves. There are a few worn tools laid carefully in the cart bed, a wooden rake with several missing teeth, a hoe with a blade that has been worn down to a thin crescent, and a small iron pot with a crack in its side that has been mended with a strip of lead. These are not things of great value, but they are things that might find a new purpose in someone else's hands. And there is a small sack of grain, not wheat this time, but barley, the grain small and plump and a warm golden brown, the last of the previous year's harvest that was stored in the granary and has now been deemed surplus to the needs of the household. The sack is made of coarse, undyed linen, and it is tied at the top with a leather thong. The road rises slightly as it crosses a low swell in the land, and the ox leans into the harness, its large head lowering, the muscles in its shoulders and haunches shifting under the loose skin. The cart creaks a little louder, the axle taking the slight additional strain, and then the rise is past, and the road levels out again, and the ox resumes its slow, steady plod. The driver walks on, his hand still resting on the shaft, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He does not look back at the cart or at you. His attention is on the way forward, though there is little to see other than the pale ribbon of road unwinding slowly toward the horizon. The landscape on either side of the road is the same landscape you have come to know over these days. Fields of pale, stunted wheat, patches of dry grass that crackles underfoot, the occasional stand of trees that offer a dark, welcome patch of shade. But here, on the road, the landscape seems to exist only as a backdrop to the slow, hypnotic rhythm of the cart. You find that your own footsteps have fallen into the same slow cadence as the ox's hooves, and your breathing has slowed to match the pace of the journey. There is no need to hurry, no destination that must be reached by a certain hour. The market town will be there when you arrive, whether that is at midday or in the late afternoon or even in the early evening. The road is long, but it is not demanding. It simply asks that you put one foot in front of the other, over and over, until the journey is done. The sun has now cleared the hills to the east, and its light washes across the road in a flood of pale gold. The dust that rises from the cartwheels and the ox's hooves catches the light and seems to glow, forming a soft, luminous cloud that hangs in the air behind the cart before slowly settling back to the road. The dust is very fine as the flour you saw in the baker's trough, and it coats everything with a thin, pale layer. The leaves of the bushes by the side of the road are dusted with it, giving them a ghostly, faded appearance. The driver's hat and shoulders are coated with it, turning the dark wool of his tunic a shade lighter. Your own boots and the lower part of your breeches are already filmed with the pale dust, and you can feel it on your face, a fine, dry grit that is almost imperceptible unless you rub your fingers together. You watch the wheels of the cart as they turn, a slow, mesmerizing rotation that seems to embody the very essence of the journey. The wheels are large, and each rotation covers a surprising amount of ground, but the rotations are so slow that you can easily count them. One rotation, a pause while the ox takes 4 more steps, another rotation. The iron tires make a continuous, low grinding sound against the sandy surface of the road, a sound that is like the distant rumble of thunder, but softer and more sustained. The wooden spokes, each one a slightly different shade of weathered grey, pass before your eyes in a regular sequence, and you find that if you watch them for too long, they begin to have a hypnotic effect, a kind of visual lullaby that makes your eyelids feel heavy and your thoughts slow and diffuse. The road crosses a small stone bridge over a stream that is barely more than a trickle. The stream bed is mostly dry, with only a thin ribbon of water moving slowly over a bed of smooth, dark stones. The bridge is old, its stones covered with a thick cushion of dark green moss and pale grey lichen, and the cartwheels make a hollow, rumbling sound as they pass over the arched stone surface. The sound echoes slightly in the small valley, bouncing off the banks of the stream and fading slowly into the quiet air. On the other side of the bridge, the road begins a long, gentle descent into a shallow valley, and the ox adjusts its pace almost imperceptibly, leaning back slightly against the weight of the cart as it pushes forward from behind. The driver shifts his hand on the shaft, a small automatic adjustment, and the journey continues. In the distance, perhaps a mile ahead, you can see a small cluster of buildings gathered around a crossroads, a hamlet even smaller than the one you left behind. A thin column of smoke rises from one of the chimneys, pale against the pale blue of the morning sky, and it drifts slowly to the east, pulled by a breeze that you cannot feel at ground level. The cart will pass through this hamlet without stopping, for there is nothing there to trade and no reason to delay. The road simply runs through the center of the small settlement, between the low stone houses and past the tiny, weathered church, and then it continues on, out the other side and into the open countryside once more. The people of the hamlet, if they notice the cart at all, will glance up from their work, note its passing with a brief unsurprised look, and then return to whatever task occupies their hands. The passage of a cart on the white road is not an event. It is simply part of the slow background rhythm of life, like the rising and setting of the sun or the changing of the seasons. As you walk, you become aware of the small details of the road itself. The surface is not uniform. It varies from packed hard earth to stretches of loose sandy gravel where the footing is less certain. In these sandy stretches, the cartwheels sink in slightly, leaving deep soft tracks that slowly fill in behind them, and the ox's hooves make a different sound, a soft, shuffling sound rather than the solid thud of packed earth. There are ruts in the road too, deep parallel grooves that have been worn by the passage of countless cartwheels over countless years. These ruts are most pronounced in the places where the road passes over a slight rise or where it curves around a hillside, places where the wheels naturally want to follow the same path. The driver guides the ox carefully to keep the cartwheels in the ruts, for the ruts represent the smoothest and easiest path, the path of least resistance that has been established by the collective wisdom of all those who have traveled this road before. The wheels settle into the ruts with a slight, satisfying thump, and the cart seems to glide more easily for a while, the axle creaking less, the load shifting less. The sun climbs higher, and the warmth of the day begins to make itself felt. The dust on the road seems to rise more readily now, disturbed not only by the cart but by the heating of the air, which creates small invisible currents that lift the finest particles and carry them a few inches into the air before letting them fall again. The horizon ahead begins to shimmer and waver, a common sight on a warm day on a long, straight road, a visual effect that is caused by the heating of the air near the ground and that makes distant objects seem to dance and flicker. The market town, which you cannot yet see, lies somewhere beyond that shimmering horizon, and it seems impossibly distant, a place that exists only as an idea, a destination that will be reached not by hurrying, but simply by continuing to put one foot in front of the other. The driver stops for a moment, not to rest but to adjust something on the cart. He walks around to the back and checks the binding on the bundle of flax, tightening the twine with a quick, practiced motion. He pats the small cask of honey, feeling the solid, heavy weight of it, and he runs his hand over the sack of barley, feeling the shape of the grains through the coarse fabric. Satisfied that everything is secure, he returns to his place at the ox's side, clicks his tongue softly. A sound that is barely audible, and the ox begins to move again. The cart creaks, the chain jingles, and the slow journey resumes. The morning passes in this way, one slow step after another, the road unwinding beneath your feet and the wheels of the cart. The landscape changes almost imperceptibly, the fields of wheat giving way to pastures where a few thin sheep graze on the dry, sparse grass, the low hills becoming slightly steeper and more wooded. The road follows the contour of the land, curving gently around the base of a hill, and then straightening out again, always pointing toward the west, toward the river and the town. You find that your mind has become quiet, emptied of the small, busy thoughts that usually occupy it. There is only the road, and the cart, and the slow, steady rhythm of the journey. The sound of the wheels, the creak of the axle, the soft thud of the hooves, these sounds have become a kind of music, a slow, repetitive melody that lulls you into a state of calm, wakeful rest. After a long time, the road crests a final low rise, and there, spread out in the valley below, is the market town. It is larger than the village you left behind, with a cluster of stone buildings gathered around a central square and the spire of a larger church rising above the rooftops. The river, still narrow and sluggish, winds past the edge of the town, its surface glinting in the midday sun. The driver does not change his pace at the sight of the town. The ox does not lift its head or quicken its step. The car continues down the gentle slope toward the town gates, its wheels creaking, its load shifting, its dust rising in a pale cloud that drifts slowly behind it. The journey is not yet over, but the end is in sight, and it will be reached in the same slow, patient manner in which it was begun. One step at a time, the cart moving steadily along the white road that has carried so many others before it, and will carry so many more after. The long afternoon has faded into a soft, golden twilight that seems to linger over the village like a held breath. You have returned from the white road, the dust of the journey still clinging to your boots and the hem of your clothing, and now you find yourself drawn to a quiet corner of the hamlet, where a low stone wall encloses a small yard of packed earth. In this yard, against the western wall of a house, there is a long stone bench, its surface worn to a gentle concave smoothness by generations of people sitting upon it in just this way, at just this hour. The bench catches the last of the day's light, and the stone, a pale, warm limestone, seems to glow faintly from within, holding the memory of the sun long after the sun itself has dipped below the line of poplar trees that marks the horizon. The air is cooler now, the intense, dry heat of the afternoon giving way to a pleasant coolness that carries the scent of wood smoke from the evening cooking fires and the faint, sweet fragrance of the honeysuckle that climbs the wall beside you, its pale trumpet-shaped flowers just beginning to open in the fading light. On the stone bench sit three figures, a woman, a man, and between them, draped across their laps and spilling down onto the ground in soft, tangled folds, a long fishing net. The net is made of hemp cord, a coarse, fibrous material that has been twisted and spun into a strong, durable twine. The color of the hemp is a warm, golden brown where it is new, fading to a silvery gray where it has been exposed to sun and water over many seasons. The net is old and has been mended many times before. You can see the evidence of this in the patches of different colored twine, some darker and some lighter, that have been woven into the original mesh. The net smells faintly of the river, a clean, earthy smell of water and mud, and the small silvery fish it once held, a smell that has been baked into the fibers by the sun and the air, and that will never entirely wash out. It is a smell that belongs to this place and this life, a smell that speaks of the patient work of waiting and the quiet satisfaction of a full net. You find a place to sit on a low, flat stone near the bench, close enough to watch the work of mending but far enough away to be outside the small circle of their quiet concentration. Your back rests against the cool stones of the house wall, which still radiate a faint, residual warmth from the day's sun, and you let your body settle into the stillness of the evening. The light is soft and diffuse, casting long, gentle shadows that stretch across the packed earth of the yard, and the colors of the world have deepened into a rich palette of gold and amber and soft, dusky purple. The sounds of the village are muted at this hour, the day's labor done, the evening meal being prepared behind closed doors. From somewhere nearby comes the soft, rhythmic clucking of chickens settling onto their roost for the night, a sound that is both busy and drowsy. Further off, a dog barks once, a single, low note, and then is silent. The woman holds the net in her lap, her fingers working among the tangled cords with a slow, patient dexterity. Her hands are brown and weathered, the skin creased with fine lines, the knuckles slightly swollen from years of work. She wears a simple linen shift and a woolen shawl draped loosely over her shoulders, the fabric a soft, faded blue that has been washed so many times it is almost grey. Her hair is pulled back and covered with a linen cloth, and her face, in the twilight, is calm and focused, her eyes dark and steady, fixed on the section of netting before her. In her right hand she holds a large wooden needle, a smooth, polished slip of wood about the length of her palm, with a blunt point and a notch at one end where the mending twine is secured. The needle is dark with age and use, the wood almost black in the dim light, and it moves through the mesh with a quiet, assured grace. Beside her, the man holds a different section of the net, his large hands spreading the mesh taut so that the woman can see the broken strands and the gaps where the knots have come undone. He does not speak. His role is simply to hold and to wait, to provide the steady, patient support that allows the mending to proceed. His face is as weathered as hers, the skin browned and lined by sun and wind, and his eyes, pale and calm, gaze off into the middle distance, not really seeing the yard or the wall or the darkening sky, but resting in a place of quiet, internal stillness. He wears a simple tunic of undyed wool, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and his forearms are corded with the lean muscle of a life of physical work. His hands are still, holding the net with a gentle, unwavering grip, the cords resting across his broad palms like a familiar burden. The third figure is a child, a girl of perhaps 8 or 9 summers, who sits at the far end of the bench, her small legs dangling and swinging slowly back and forth. In her lap she holds a small tangled piece of the net, a section that has been set aside for her to practice on, a piece where the damage is minor and the knots are simple. She holds her own small wooden needle, a miniature version of the woman's tool, and she pokes at the mesh with a look of intense, focused concentration, her small brow furrowed, her tongue caught between her teeth. The woman glances over at her occasionally, a brief, soft look that is both instruction and encouragement, but she says nothing. The child works on, her small fingers clumsy but determined, learning the slow, patient rhythm that will one day be as natural to her as breathing. The woman finds a broken strand, a place where the hemp cord is frayed and parted, leaving a gap in the mesh. She draws the net closer to her face, her eyes narrowing slightly as she examines the damage. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she threads the loose end of the mending twine through the notch in her needle, pulling it taut with a soft, zipping sound. The twine is new, a pale, golden brown that stands out against the weathered grey of the old net. She begins to weave the needle through the mesh, in and out, her hands moving in a pattern that is as old as the river itself. The needle goes down through a loop. The twine pulls through with a soft, rustling sound. The needle comes up and over and down through the next loop, and then, with a quick, precise motion, she ties a knot. The knot is small and tight, a simple, sturdy hitch that will hold against the pull of the water and the weight of the fish. She pulls the twine snug, and the knot settles into place with a tiny, final sound, a soft click that is barely audible. The work continues in this way, a slow, repetitive cycle of motion and sound. The needle dips and rises, the twine whispers through the mesh, the knot is tied and tightened. The woman's hands move with a rhythm that is almost hypnotic, a rhythm that seems to slow the very passage of time. The man holds the net steady, his hands unmoving, his breathing slow and even. The child works on her own small piece, her needle moving with a slower, more hesitant rhythm, and knots sometimes needing to be undone and retied, her small sighs of frustration barely audible. The evening deepens around them, the gold of the twilight fading to a soft, dusky grey, and the first stars, faint and tentative, begin to appear in the darkening sky above the poplar trees. You let your gaze drift across the scene, taking in the small, quiet details. The texture of the hemp cord, rough and fibrous where it is old, smooth and slightly waxy where it is new. The way the light catches the polished surface of the wooden needle, making it gleam for a moment before it disappears into the mesh. The pattern of the net itself, a complex, geometric lattice of diamonds and squares, each one a small, perfect opening that will allow the water to flow through while trapping the fish within. The net is not for the river, not now. The river is too low, the water too sluggish, the fish too few. But the net must be mended nonetheless, for the seasons will turn, the rains will come, the river will rise and quicken, and the fish will return. The mending is an act of faith, a quiet, patient preparation for a future that is not yet visible, but is as certain as the turning of the year. The woman pauses in her work, setting the needle down on her lap and flexing her fingers, which have grown stiff from the repetitive motion. She rubs her hands together slowly, feeling the warmth return to the joints, and then she picks up the needle and resumes her work. The man shifts slightly on the bench, adjusting his grip on the net, and the cords rustle softly in his hands. The child has completed a small section of her practice piece, and she holds it up for the woman to see. The woman leans over, her eyes scanning the child's work, and she gives a small, slow nod, a gesture of approval that is more eloquent than any words. The child's face, barely visible in the fading light, breaks into a small, quiet smile, and she returns to her work with renewed concentration. The sound of the mending is a soft, continuous whisper, a sound that blends with the other sounds of the evening. The rustle of the hemp cord, the soft zip of the twine pulling through the mesh, the tiny click of the knots being tied. These sounds are joined by the distant murmur of voices from the houses nearby, the low, contented cooing of the pigeons settling in the dovercote, the soft rustle of the honeysuckle leaves in the faint evening breeze. The air is cool and still, and it carries the mingled scents of the village, wood smoke and cooking food, the dry, dusty smell of the road, the clean mineral smell of the well water, and underneath it all the faint, earthy smell of the river, carried on the breeze from the valley below. The woman has reached a section of the net where the damage is more extensive, a larger gap where several strands have broken and the mesh is pulled apart. She sets down her needle and takes up a small, sharp knife, its blade worn thin and bright from years of use. With careful, precise cuts, she trims away the frayed ends of the broken cords, clearing the area so that she can begin the repair. The cut ends fall away, small dry fragments of hemp that drift down to settle on her lap and on the ground. She then takes a longer piece of the new twine and begins to weave it into the gap, creating a new section of mesh to replace the one that was lost. This work is slower, more deliberate, requiring her to count the loops and measure the spacing with her eye and her experienced touch. The man leans in slightly, his hands adjusting to hold the net open and steady, his presence a silent support. The child has finished her practice piece and has set it aside. She now sits quietly, watching the woman's hands, her eyes following the movement of the needle as it weaves in and out of the mesh. She asks no questions, and the woman offers no explanations. The learning happens through watching, through the slow, patient absorption of the rhythm and the pattern. One day, the child's hands will know this work as well as the woman's hands know it, the knowledge passed down not through words, but through the quiet repetition of countless evenings, just like this one. The twilight has deepened into true dusk. The sky a deep, velvety blue in the east, and a faint, lingering band of pale gold in the west. The stars are brighter now, more numerous, scattered across the darkening dome like small, cold points of light. A bat flits overhead, a dark, silent shape against the fading sky, its flight erratic and swift as it hunts for insects in the cooling air. The woman pauses again, this time to reach down and pick up a small clay lamp that sits on the ground beside the bench. The lamp is a simple, shallow bowl filled with olive oil, with a twisted linen wick floating on the surface. She takes a small piece of kindling from a pile by the wall, lights it from the embers of a nearby cooking fire that still glows faintly in a stone ring, and touches the flame to the wick. The wick catches with a soft, fluttering sound, and a small, steady flame appears, casting a warm, golden circle of light over the bench and the net and the three figures. The light flickers and dances with the faint movements of the air, sending shifting shadows across the stone wall and the packed earth. The flame is small, no larger than your thumb, but it is enough to see by, enough to continue the slow, patient work of mending. In the lamplight, the colors of the scene take on a new depth and warmth. The woman's face, lined and weathered, is softened by the golden glow, and her eyes, focused on her work, seem to hold a quiet, inner light of their own. The man's hands holding the net are illuminated, the texture of his skin and the fine hairs on his forearms visible in the flickering light. The child's face, turned toward the woman, is a study in quiet attention, her dark eyes reflecting the small flame. The net itself, spread across their laps and spilling onto the ground, is a complex tapestry of light and shadow, the new pale twine catching the light and seeming to glow against the darker weathered mesh. The woman works on, her needle moving in its slow, steady rhythm. The sound of the mending, the soft whisper of the twine and the tiny click of the knots fills the small circle of lamplight, a sound that is both intimate and vast, connecting this small, quiet moment to all the other evenings, all the other hands, all the other nets that have been mended in just this way, in just this light. For as long as anyone can remember, the night settles in around you, soft and deep and still, and the only thing that moves is the needle in the woman's hand, weaving together the broken strands, preparing the net for the day when the river will rise and the fish will return, and the patient work of mending will be rewarded with the patient work of waiting and gathering. You sit on your low stone, your back against the warm wall, and you let the slow, steady rhythm of the evening wash over you, a quiet lullaby of hempen lamplight, and the soft, endless whisper of the net being made whole again. The heat of the day has driven you indoors, away from the white glare of the afternoon sun that beats down upon the village and the fields. You have found your way into a room that is cool and dim, a room at the back of one of the older stone houses, where the walls are so thick that the warmth of the summer cannot penetrate, and the air holds a constant, pleasant coolness that seems to rise from the very earth itself. The room is small and square, with a single high window that is little more than a narrow slit in the stone, covered not with glass but with a piece of oiled linen that admits a soft, diffuse light, the color of pale honey. The floor is made of wide, dark planks of chestnut wood, worn smooth and uneven by generations of bare feet, and it gives off a faint, dry smell of old timber and the dust that has settled into the grain over many long years. Against one wall, occupying a place of quiet prominence, stands the linen press. The linen press is a large and imposing piece of furniture, taller than a man and nearly as wide, built of dark, heavy oak that has aged to a deep, rich brown, almost black in the dim corners. It is a simple, sturdy construction, the work of a local carpenter long ago, its surfaces unadorned by carving or decoration, its beauty lying entirely in the quality of the wood and the precision of the joinery. The front of the press is divided into two large doors, each one fitted with a pair of heavy iron hinges that are black with age and rough with the texture of old rust. The doors are held closed by a simple iron latch, a curved bar that fits into a slot and is secured with a wooden peg. The top of the press is flat and broad, and upon it rest a few small objects, a wooden comb with several missing teeth, a small clay pot with a chipped rim, and a bundle of dried lavender tied with a faded blue ribbon. The whole structure rests on four short, stout legs that raise it just a few inches off the floor, protecting the wood from the damp of the ground. You step closer to the press, and your hand reaches out to touch the surface of the wood. It is cool and smooth, the grain visible as a series of fine, parallel lines that flow in gentle waves around the small knots and irregularities. The wood has been polished by years of handling and by the simple passage of time, and it has a soft, silky feel under your fingertips, a feel that is both dry and slightly oily, as if the essence of the oak has risen to the surface and hardened into a protective skin. The iron hinges are rough and cold, and when you touch one, a small flake of rust comes away on your finger, a fine dark orange powder that leaves a faint stain. The latch is stiff, and when you lift it, the iron makes a low grating sound against the iron slot, a sound that is small but distinct in the quiet of the room. You open the doors of the press, and they swing outward with a soft, deep groan from the hinges, a sound that seems to come from the very heart of the old wood. The interior of the press is a single, deep space, divided into two sections by a thick, horizontal shelf. The space is dark, and as the doors open, a scent is released, a scent that has been trapped and concentrated within the closed cabinet for many months. It is the scent of clean, dry linen, a smell that is both simple and complex, made up of the faint, dusty odor of the flax fibers, the clean, sharp trace of the lye soap used in the washing, and the sweet, herbaceous fragrance of the dried lavender that has been placed between the folds. The scent is not strong or overpowering. It is a gentle, subtle presence, a quiet perfume that speaks of order and care, and the slow, patient rhythms of domestic life. The upper shelf of the press holds a stack of bed linens, the large rectangular sheets of coarse, undyed linen that are used for sleeping. You reach in and lift the topmost sheet from the pile, feeling the weight of it in your hands. The linen is heavy and substantial, not the fine, smooth fabric of modern times, but a rougher, more honest cloth woven on a simple loom from the fibers of the flax plant that you saw growing in the fields. The weave is visible, a regular grid-like pattern of vertical and horizontal threads that intersect at right angles, creating a texture that is both sturdy and slightly uneven. The color of the linen is a warm, creamy beige, the natural color of the flax fibers which have been bleached not by chemicals but by the sun and the air and the repeated washings in the river. The fabric is cool to the touch, and it has a faint, pleasant roughness, a texture that you can feel when you rub it between your thumb and forefinger. You bring the sheet closer to your face and breathe in the scent that clings to it. The lavender is there, a sweet, floral note that rises above the clean, dusty smell of the linen. The lavender was picked last summer from the small, bushy plants that grow along the sunny side of the garden wall. Their purple flowers gathered at just the right moment when the buds were full but not yet open, and then tied into small bundles and hung from the rafters to dry in the warm, dark air of the attic. The dried flowers are now a pale grayish purple, their color faded, but their fragrance concentrated and preserved. A few of the tiny dried buds have become trapped in the folds of the linen, and they fall out as you handle the sheet, drifting down to the wooden floor like small, fragrant seeds. You lay the sheet out on the top of the press, smoothing it with the flat of your hand. The fabric resists slightly, the coarse weave catching on the small roughnesses of your palm, but gradually it flattens out, revealing the full extent of the piece. The sheet is large, larger than you might expect, and it is made of two narrower strips of linen that have been sewn together down the center with a fine, even seam. The stitching is small and regular, the work of patient hands, and the thread, a pale undyed linen, blends almost invisibly into the fabric. You run your finger along the seam, feeling the slight ridge where the two edges overlap, a small, tactile reminder of the work that went into the making of this simple, essential object. The process of folding the sheet is a slow and deliberate one, a process that has its own quiet rhythm and its own careful steps. You take one corner of the sheet and bring it across to meet the opposite corner, folding the large rectangle in half. You smooth the fold with your hand, pressing out the small wrinkles and ensuring that the edges align. The linen makes a soft, rustling sound as it moves, a sound that is like the whisper of dry leaves. You fold it again, this time bringing the two short ends together, and again you smooth the fabric, feeling the layers build up under your palm. The sheet is now a smaller, thicker rectangle, and you continue to fold it, each fold precise and even, until it is a neat, compact square that will fit perfectly on the shelf of the press. You set the folded sheet aside, and it sits there, a tidy, self-contained bundle of clean linen and lavender. The lower shelf of the press holds a different kind of linen, the smaller, more personal items of everyday use. There are squares of coarser cloth for drying dishes and wiping hands, their surfaces rougher and more textured than the bed sheets, with small, loose threads and the occasional thin spot where the weave has worn away. There are long, narrow strips of linen that are used for bandages or for tying up bundles, rolled into tight cylinders and stacked side by side. There are several simple linen shifts, the basic garment worn next to the skin, their shapes simple and unadorned, with wide, loose sleeves and a drawstring at the neck. You lift one of these shifts from the pile, and it is lighter than the bed sheet, the fabric softer and more supple from having been worn and washed many times. The linen has a different scent here, a fainter trace of lavender mixed with the more personal, intimate smell of the person who wears it, a smell that is clean and warm and slightly human. You hold the shift up, and the light from the narrow window passes through the thin fabric, revealing the variations in the weave, the places where the threads are slightly thicker or thinner, the small, irregular slubs that are characteristic of hand-spun and hand-woven linen. The shift is a simple, practical garment, designed for comfort and durability, and it has been mended in several places, a small patch near the hem, a line of neat stitching where a seam has come undone, a reinforced area under one arm. The mending is done with the same careful, patient skill that you observed in the mending of the fishing net. The stitches, small and even. The thread a close match to the original fabric. The shift has been cared for, preserved, kept in good order against the needs of the coming days. You fold the shift with the same slow, deliberate care you applied to the sheet. The fabric is more pliable, easier to shape, and it seems to want to fall into neat folds of its own accord. You smooth it, align the edges, fold it once, twice, 3 times until it is a small, soft bundle that fits easily in the palm of your hand. You place it back on the shelf, nestling it among its companions, and you reach for another piece, a long rectangular cloth that is used for covering bread dough as it rises. This cloth is the coarsest of all, its surface almost fuzzy with the loose fibers of the flax, and it has a faint, yeasty smell that mingles with the lavender, a smell that speaks of the kitchen and the bakehouse and the daily making of bread. The work of folding and arranging the linen is slow and repetitive, a task that requires no great thought or concentration, but that rewards a quiet, steady attention. Each piece has its own shape and size, its own texture and scent, its own small history of use and care. You handle each one gently, smoothing the wrinkles, aligning the edges, folding it into the precise, compact shape that will fit on the shelf. The pile of folded linen grows slowly, a neat, orderly stack of cream and beige and soft, faded white. The scent of lavender rises from the press in soft, intermittent waves, released by the movement of the fabric, and it fills the small room with its sweet, calming presence. On the very bottom of the press, beneath the lower shelf, there is a shallow drawer that you have not yet opened. You kneel down on the cool wooden floor, feeling the hard planks under your knees, and you pull the drawer open. It slides out with a soft, scraping sound, the wood rubbing against wood. Inside the drawer are the most precious of the household linens, the pieces that are used only on special occasions, the ones that are handed down from mother to daughter and from daughter to granddaughter. There is a small square cloth of finer linen than any you have seen yet. Its weave so tight and even that the surface is almost smooth, and its edges are decorated with a simple drawn thread hem, a line of tiny open squares where the threads have been carefully removed and the remaining threads bound together. There is a long marrow runner for the table, embroidered along its length with a simple pattern of leaves and flowers in a pale faded blue thread. The stitch is small and even, the work of many patient hours. There is a small bundle of linen napkins, each one hemmed with the same careful stitching, each one bearing the faint, permanent creases of having been folded and stored in just this way for many years. You lift the small embroidered runner from the drawer and spread it out on your lap. The fabric is soft and fine, and the embroidery, though faded, is still clear and distinct. The pattern is a simple repeating design of a stem with small leaves and a single stylized flower. A flower that might be a rose or might be a representation of the lavender that scents the press. The thread is a pale, washed-out blue, the color of the summer sky when it is seen through a thin haze, and it has a soft, silky sheen that catches the light. You run your finger over the embroidery, feeling the slight roughness of the stitches, the way they stand up from the surface of the linen. The work is simple, not elaborate or showy, but it is beautiful in its simplicity and its care, a small, quiet expression of the human desire to make even the most practical objects a little bit lovely. You fold the runner carefully, smoothing it flat and aligning the edges, and you return it to the drawer. You take a moment to rearrange the contents of the drawer, placing the larger pieces at the bottom and the smaller ones on top, creating a neat, orderly arrangement that will protect the fabric and make it easy to find what is needed. The drawer slides back into place with the same soft scraping sound, and you close the doors of the press. The latch drops into its slot with a small, solid click, and the interior of the press, with its neat stacks of folded linen and its hidden treasures, is sealed away once more, protected from the dust and the light and the passing of the days. You remain kneeling on the floor for a moment longer, your hands resting on the cool, smooth wood of the press. The scent of lavender lingers in the air around you, a soft, sweet fragrance that seems to wrap around you like a gentle embrace. The room is quiet and still, the only sound the faint, distant murmur of the village outside, a sound that is muffled by the thick stone walls and that seems to come from very far away. The light from the narrow window has shifted, the pale honey color deepening to a richer, warmer gold as the afternoon wears on, and a single mote of dust drifts slowly through the beam of light, catching the sun and glowing like a tiny, floating star. You rise to your feet, your knees slightly stiff from the hard floor, and you take one last look at the linen press. It stands against the wall, dark and solid and silent, a guardian of the household's soft goods, a keeper of the scents and textures of daily life. The bundle of dried lavender on the top of the press has shifted slightly, and a few of the tiny purple-green buds have fallen onto the dark wood, where they lie like small, fragrant seeds. You pick one up and hold it to your nose, breathing in the concentrated sweetness of the flower, the essence of a summer that has passed, and a promise of the summer that will come again. You place the bud back on the press, and you turn toward the door, leaving the cool, dim room and its quiet, orderly calm behind you, carrying with you the scent of lavender and clean linen, a scent that will linger in your memory long after you have stepped back out into the warm, dry air of the late afternoon. The morning of the first day of October arrived with a sky that was not blue. You noticed this change the moment you stepped out of the house into the cool, still air, your eyes lifting by habit to the pale, washed-out dome that had presided over the village and the fields for so many long months. That familiar pale blue was gone, replaced by a color that had no easy name, a color that was like unpolished pewter or the underside of a dove's wing, a soft, uniform gray that stretched from horizon to horizon without a single break or variation. The grey was not dark or threatening. It was a quiet, muted grey, a grey that seemed to absorb sound and light rather than reflect them, and it hung over the land like a thick, soft blanket that had been laid down with great care. The air itself felt different against your skin, carrying a slight weight and a faint, cool dampness that you had almost forgotten the feel of. It was not rain, not yet, but it was the promise of rain, the long-awaited shift in the weather that everyone had watched for and hoped for, and quietly, patiently expected. You walked out into the yard, and the ground under your boots was the same hard, dry earth it had been for months, but the light that fell upon it was different. The harsh white glare of the summer sun was gone, replaced by a soft, diffuse illumination that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Shadows were faint and indistinct, mere suggestions of darkness rather than sharp, definite shapes. The colors of the world, which had been bleached and faded by the relentless sun, seemed to deepen and intensify under this grey light, the browns becoming richer, the greens more somber, the pale limestone of the walls taking on a warm, almost golden hue. The leaves of the oak tree at the edge of the yard, which had hung limp and dusty for so long, now seemed to lift slightly, their surfaces turned toward the sky as if in anticipation. A single dry leaf detached itself from a branch and drifted down in a slow, spiraling path, landing on the packed earth with a sound so soft it was barely audible, a tiny, papery whisper. The first drop fell while you were standing there looking up at the pewter sky. It did not fall with a splash or a crash. It simply arrived, a single, cool, round bead of water that landed on the back of your hand with a soft, startling plunk. You looked down at it, a small, perfect dome of clear liquid resting on your skin, and then you looked up again, and another drop fell, this time on your forehead, a cool, gentle touch that made you blink. The drops were few and far between at first, individual travelers descending from the grey expanse, each one making its own small, distinct sound as it struck the dry earth or the stone wall or the leaves of the oak. A drop landed on a broad, flat stone near your feet, and it left a dark, round stain, a circle of wetness that spread slowly outward, darkening the pale grey of the stone to a deep, rich charcoal. Another drop hit a dusty leaf of the honeysuckle vine, and it rolled off, leaving a clean, green trail through the pale coating of dust. The rain increased so gradually that it was difficult to say exactly when it changed from a few scattered drops to a gentle, steady fall. There was no sudden downpour, no dramatic shift. The drops simply grew closer together, their individual sounds beginning to overlap and merge, until the air was filled with a soft, continuous patter, a sound like 1,000 tiny fingertips drumming lightly on every surface. You remained standing in the yard, letting the rain fall on you, feeling the cool, gentle touch of each drop as it landed on your hair and your shoulders and your upturned face. The water was cool but not cold, and it carried a clean, fresh smell, the smell of the high, grey sky and the distant places from which it had traveled. It was a smell that seemed to wash the dust from the air itself, replacing the dry, earthy scents of summer with something cleaner and sharper and full of quiet promise. The sound of the rain on the roof tiles of the house behind you began as a faint, distant whisper, and grew into a low, steady murmur, a sound that was like the voice of a gentle stream, or the rustle of 1,000 leaves in a soft breeze. The curved clay tiles, baked hard by the summer sun, received the rain with a series of soft, individual ticks, each drop striking the terracotta with a tiny, musical note. And as the rain increased, these notes merged into a continuous, murmuring chorus that filled the air around you. The sound was deeply soothing, a sound that seemed to speak of rest and renewal, and you found yourself closing your eyes for a moment, letting it wash over you like the rain itself. When you opened your eyes, you looked out across the yard and toward the fields beyond. The rain was now a steady, vertical veil of grey, a shimmering curtain that softened the outlines of the distant trees and the low hills. The dusty, pale surface of the yard was changing before your eyes, the hard-packed earth darkening from a light, dusty brown to a deep, rich umber as the water soaked in. The transformation was slow, almost imperceptible at first, but as you watched, you could see the dark stain of moisture spreading across the ground, moving outward from the points where the drops had first fallen, joining together into larger patches of wetness until the entire yard was a single dark, glistening expanse. The dust that had coated everything for so long was being washed away, carried off in tiny muddy rivulets that began to form and flow across the surface of the ground, finding the low places and the small channels that had been carved by the last rain so many months ago. You walked slowly toward the edge of the yard, where the ground sloped down toward the cart track. The rain continued to fall, a gentle, persistent presence that seemed to wrap around you like a cool, damp cloak. Your boots made a soft, sucking sound as they pressed into the now muddy earth, and you could feel the ground yielding under your weight for the first time in a very long while. The earth was drinking the water, absorbing it eagerly, and as you walked, you noticed the smell that was rising from the ground, a smell that was as old and as fundamental as the earth itself. It was the smell of wet soil, a complex and deeply satisfying fragrance made up of the clean, mineral scent of the stones and the rich, organic scent of the decaying leaves and roots and the tiny, invisible creatures that lived in the dark, damp world beneath the surface. It was a smell that spoke of life and growth, a smell that had been absent for so long that you'd almost forgotten it, and now it rose around you in waves, filling your lungs with its cool, earthy richness. At the edge of the yard where the cart track ran past the low stone wall, you stopped and looked out over the fields. The wheat field, which you had visited in the dry heat of late spring, was now a stubble field, the short, pale stalks having been harvested weeks ago, leaving behind a rough golden-brown carpet of cut stems. The rain was falling on the stubble with a soft, rustling sound, a sound that was different from the murmur on the roof tiles, a lighter, drier sound, like the shaking of 1,000 tiny rattles. The bare earth between the rows of stubble was darkening just as the yard had done, the pale, dusty soil turning a deep, rich brown as the water soaked in. The cracks in the earth, the deep fissures that had opened during the long, dry months, were filling with water, the dark lines becoming small, glistening streams that trickled down into the depths, carrying the first moisture to the deep roots of the plants that would grow there next year. You turned and looked back at the village. The stone walls of the houses had changed color, the pale limestone darkening to a warm honey brown as the rain soaked into the porous surface. The red-tiled roofs glistened with a wet sheen, and thin streams of water were beginning to run down the channels between the tiles, dripping from the eaves in a slow, rhythmic pattern. A single drop of water hung from the edge of a tile near you, growing slowly larger and heavier, and then it fell, landing on a stone below with a soft, liquid plink. Another drop began to form immediately, taking its place, and the cycle continued, a small, perfect repetition that was part of the larger rhythm of the rain. You walked back toward the house, and as you passed under the broad branches of the oak tree, the sound of the rain changed again. The dense canopy of leaves caught much of the water, and the rain that reached you here was a softer, more intermittent patter, the drops finding their way through the leaves and falling with a heavier, more deliberate sound. The leaves themselves were wet and dark, and they hung heavy with the weight of the water, dripping steadily onto the ground below. The bark of the oak, which had been dry and rough, was now dark and slick, and it glistened in the dim light. You placed your hand on the trunk, and the bark was cool and wet and slightly soft under your palm, the moss and lichen that grew in the crevices plumped and revived by the moisture. You went inside the house, into the same cool, dim room where the linen press stood against the wall. The sound of the rain was different in here, muffled by the thick stone walls and the small high window. It was a distant, continuous murmur, a sound that seemed to come from very far away, and it filled the room with a sense of quiet shelter. The light that came through the oiled linen of the window was a soft grey glow, and it illuminated the dark wood of the press and the pale limestone of the walls with a gentle, even light. You sat down on a low wooden stool near the press, and you listened to the rain. The sound was so steady, so unvarying, that it began to seem like a part of the silence itself, a background hum that was always there, like the beating of your own heart. The rain continued through the afternoon, never growing heavier, never slackening, just a steady, soaking fall that seemed to have no beginning and no end. You could imagine it falling on the fields and the river and the forest, on the roofs of the village and the distant town, on the white road that you had walked and the stone bridge over the dry stream. You could imagine the dry stream bed beginning to fill, the first trickles of water finding their way over the smooth, dark stones, joining together into a thin, clear flow that would grow and strengthen as the rain continued. You could imagine the river rising slowly, the water spreading out over the wide, pale banks of sand and pebbles, reclaiming the bed that it had abandoned during the long, dry summer. You could imagine the well in the center of the village, the dark shaft filling drop by drop, the distant glimmer of water rising inch by inch toward the light. The evening came early under the grey sky, the soft, diffuse light of the afternoon fading into a deeper, more profound grey that was almost blue in its darkness. The rain continued, its sound unchanging, a steady, murmuring presence that filled the house and the village and the entire valley. A lamp was lit in the room where you sat, a small clay lamp filled with olive oil, its wick burning with a steady golden flame that cast a warm, flickering circle of light. The light caught the surface of the linen press, making the dark wood gleam softly, and it reflected in the tiny droplets of water that had found their way through the window and clung to the stone sill. You sat in the lamplight listening to the rain, and you thought about the dry season that was now ending. It had been a long, quiet time, a time of dust and stillness and patient waiting. The land had endured it as it always did, and the people had endured it as they always did, going about their slow, careful tasks, drawing the water from the deepening well, mending the nets that would one day be needed again, folding the linen with lavender, preparing for a future that they trusted would arrive. And now the future was arriving, not with a dramatic event, but with a soft, steady rain that fell on the thirsty earth and began the slow work of renewal. The sound of the rain on the roof was a lullaby, a soft, endless rhythm that seemed to slow your breathing and calm your thoughts. You could hear the individual drops now, if you listened closely, each one a tiny, distinct note in the larger murmur, each one striking the tile with a soft tick before joining the flow of water that ran down to the eaves. The drip from the eaves was a slower rhythm, a deep, liquid plink that came at regular intervals, a sound that was like a slow, steady heartbeat. The two rhythms, the fast murmur of the rain and the slow drip of the eaves, wove together into a complex, soothing tapestry of sound that filled the night. You rose from the stool and walked to the window, pulling aside the oiled linen and looking out into the darkness. You could see nothing but the faint, grey shimmer of the rain falling through the black air and the distant, blurred glow of a lamp in a neighboring house. The rain touched your face, cool and gentle, and you breathed in the clean, wet smell of the night. The earth was drinking, the river was rising, the seeds that lay dormant in the dry soil were beginning to stir. The long, dry season was over, and the slow, quiet work of the next season was beginning. You let the linen fall back into place and returned to your stool. The lamp flickered softly, the rain murmured on the roof, the drip from the eaves continued its slow, steady rhythm. You sat in the warm, golden circle of light, and you listened to the rain, and you let the sound carry you into a deep, quiet rest, a rest that was as gentle and as patient as the rain itself, falling steadily through the October night, a soft, endless whisper that would continue until the morning and beyond, bringing water and life back to the dry and waiting land.